The instrument said the world was dead, and the viewport said a monster was sleeping on a man's porch, and Assessor Telluin Vox could not make the two agree. She leaned into the glass until the cold of it pressed her brow membrane flat. Below the survey cutter, the world called Seven Seret turned under a hard white sun, exactly the color the archive had promised. Ash-gray plains, black rivers of old lava, a sky the flat blue of a stripped shell. Nothing moved on the readout. The lifeskin drew its long, clean line across the panel and held it, flat, the way it had held flat for 11 of the Registry's careful years. But there was smoke. A single thread of it, rising from the terminator line where morning had just reached the ground, straight up in the still air, gray on gray, until the wind took it. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant fuel and tending, and a hand to feed it. Telluin had assessed 400 worlds in her service, and she had never once been wrong about a dead one, and she was looking at a chimney. "Descend," she told the pilot, "slowly, and do not wake anything." The cutter dropped through a bank of pale cloud and the plane resolved, and the thread of smoke resolved with it into a low structure the size of a supply crate, roofed in salvaged hull plate that caught the sun and threw it back. A hut. Someone had built a hut on a world the conquered Registry of Worlds had ruled, under seal, incapable of holding life. And across the doorway of the hut, filling it the way a fallen tree fills a road, lay something enormous. Telluin's translator did not have a word for it, so her mind reached for the closest file and produced Revenant class, which was the survey's term for the apex form her predecessors had catalogued from orbit and never once seen alive. 6 limbs, a low armored back the color of wet slate, a head like a splitting maul. The catalogue had marked it presumed extinct with biosphere. Presumed. The word sat in her throat like a stone. The Revenant was not extinct. It was asleep. It had its great blunt head laid across the threshold, and one of its forelimbs curled in against its chest like a cat holding a paw, and in the yard beyond it a small figure in a brown coat was carrying a bucket. "By the ledger," the pilot said, which was as close to prayer as an Asun came. "Hold at 40, Telluin said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that later, when there was nothing else about the day to be proud of. "I want a full spectrum before we're seen." The spectrum came back, and it was worse than the smoke. Telluin had expected the flat line. What she got was a bloom. Around the hut in a rough ring perhaps 200 spans across, the lifeskin lit up like a wound, dense, layered, dozens of distinct signatures stacked one atop another, warm bodies breathing warm air, and threaded through them the huge slow pulse of the Revenant's heart, so strong it made the panel stammer. Outside the ring the plane went dead again. Flat. Gray. The world the Registry had sealed. Life did not do that. Life did not draw a circle and stay inside it. Life spread, or it starved, or it hunted, and on a world catalogued as a slaughterhouse, where the survey's original teams had lost 2 drones and a lander to things that struck from under the ash. Life especially did not gather calmly in one place around a fire and lie down. "Assessor," the pilot said, "the apex form, he stopped." "It's what?" "It's inside the ring, with the small ones. It's not hunting them." Telluin looked at the readout, at the great slow heart lying peaceful in the middle of all that warmth, and she felt the first cold finger of the thing that would follow her the rest of her life. The suspicion that the file was wrong, that it had always been wrong, and that she was the one who had been sent to find out how. She keyed the record. "Assessment log Vox 3rd grade standing survey of null listing 7 Seret," she said. "Be advised the seal is in error. Repeat, the null seal is in error. There is life on Seret. There is." She watched the small figure set the bucket down and straighten and shade its eyes toward the cutter, unhurried, the way you look up at weather. "There is a person on Seret." "Salvage isn't going to like that," the pilot said. "No," Telluin said, "they are not." Jonah Reeve heard the flyer before he saw it, a thin whine off to the east like a fly in a jar, and he set the water bucket down at the edge of the porch and looked up at it and thought, with no particular heat, that took 11 years. He had been told it might take longer. The clerk who'd stamped his homestead writ, a bored thing behind a counter 3 transfers out from Earth, on a station where the air smelled of hot metal and everyone was somewhere else on their way to somewhere better, had told him a null listing was as close to nothing as the law allowed you to own. No survey, no support, no claim anyone would contest because no one contested a graveyard. He'd paid the filing fee, which was small, and the transit, which was not, and he'd signed the waiver that said the registry accepted no responsibility for what happened to a body that walked onto a sealed world, and he'd meant it. He hadn't come out here to be responsible to anyone. That had been rather the point. The flyer circled once high, and Jonah went back to his morning. He filled the trough by the north wall, where the girls liked to drink after they came up. He knocked the ash off the flue with the flat of his hand, twice, out of habit, though the fire drew fine. He checked the line of stakes he'd driven at the edge of the warm ground. Not a fence, nothing so hopeful as a fence, just markers, so he'd know where the yard ended and the world began. And he found the third stake from the gate leaning, and he pushed it upright with his boot, and he did not think anything at all about the fact that the ground around it had been turned in the night. Behind him in the doorway, Bishop opened one eye. Jonah felt it more than saw it, the way you feel a big animal change its mind about being asleep. He didn't turn around. "It's a flyer," he said. "It's fine." The eye stayed open a moment, gold and slotted and older than the survey that had declared it a ghost, and then it closed, and Bishop let out a breath that stirred the dust on the sill, and went back to sleep across the door he had decided, some 14 months ago, was his. Jonah picked the bucket back up. The flyer was coming down. They landed it at the very edge of his markers, which he gave them credit for, though he suspected it was fear and not manners. The hatch opened and a ramp extended and nothing came out for a long time. Jonah waited on the porch. He had learned out here that waiting was most of the work. He'd built the porch himself out of the ribs of the hauler that had brought him, and he sat on the step of it now with his elbows on his knees and Bishop's flank warm against his back like a wall that breathed, and he watched the open hatch and let whoever was inside come to terms with what they were looking at. Eventually, one of them came down the ramp. It was tall, taller than a man by a head and more, and thin, with a body that looked assembled out of pale reeds and stretched with a gray membrane you could nearly see the light through, and a long, careful face with too many eyes arranged in a patient arc. It wore a gray sleeve of a garment stamped all over with small marks Jonah couldn't read, and it moved the way people move on ice, testing every span of ground before it trusted a limb to it. It stopped at the third of his stakes and looked at the leaning one he'd straightened, and then it looked at the turned earth around it, and Jonah watched it understand all at once that something lived under there. It went very still. "Morning," Jonah said. The thing's translator clicked and hummed and produced a voice, flat and courteous and frightened. "You are the holder of the writ," it said. "You are a human." Jonah Reeve. He didn't get up. Getting up moved Bishop, and moving Bishop first thing tended to end conversations. "You're a ways out to be checking papers." "I am Assessor Telluin Vaux of the conquered Registry of Worlds." The eyes ticked across him, across the hut, across the enormous sleeping shape in the doorway and came back to him, and it was almost funny watching a creature that size try to keep all of it in view at once. "This world is under seal, Jonah Reeve. It was ruled lifeless 11 years ago. It is not. It is not rated for habitation. It is not rated for anything. There has been an error." "No," Jonah said, "I don't think there has." Telluin had rehearsed the conversation on the way down, the way she rehearsed all of them, and none of the versions she had rehearsed began with the man saying no to the plain fact of the seal. "I assure you," she said, "the ruling stands in the record. I have read it. 4 survey passes across 2 years, 2 lost drones, a lander crew that reported," she stopped, because the report she was thinking of used the word dismantled, and the thing in the doorway was very large and very close, and she did not wish to say dismantled in front of it. The world was assessed as actively lethal to any organized biology, including its own. Nothing here could be expected to hold. Nothing could gather. Nothing could. "Build a fire," Jonah said. "Build a fire," she agreed faintly. And yet, he tipped his head at the smoke, still rising, straight and gray and impossible, from the flue he had knocked the ash off with his hand. Telluen looked at it. She was aware of her own hearts, both of them going too fast. She was aware of the ring of life on her scanner, breathing all around her in the ground and the rafters and the great slate flank against the man's back. And she was aware that she had come here to confirm a death, and instead had walked into the middle of the most crowded quarterspan she had stood in since she left the hatcheries of her own moon. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "how many are there?" He considered it, the way a man counts a thing he has never had reason to count. "Depends on the season," he said. "More in the cold. Bishop, obviously." The great head did not stir at its name, but an ear the size of a shovel blade turned a few degrees toward them, which Telluen found she did not enjoy. "The girls under the floor, that's 6. 7 now, I think there's a young one." "Rafter up top." He nodded at the eaves, and Telluen looked, and among the salvaged beams something long and folded and patient looked back at her with a row of small bright eyes and did not move. Her breath stopped. "And Pin," Jonah said, "on the sill there, but I wouldn't touch Pin." Telluen turned her head slowly, toward the window of the hut. On the sill sat a creature no longer than her smallest finger, a soft, drab, unremarkable thing, banded in dull brown, folded up small in a patch of sun. It was the least impressive living object she had seen all morning. It looked like something that had washed up. It looked like nothing. "That," she said. "That's the deadliest thing on the whole world," Jonah said, and there was, for the first time, something like warmth in his voice, the fondness a man has for a small dangerous thing he has decided to keep. "Bishop's just big. Pin's the one the diggers won't cross. I've watched Bishop step around the sill so as not to bother her." He reached over without looking and turned the bucket right side up where he'd knocked it. "You want to come up out of the sun? Kettle's on." "I don't get a lot of company, and the ones I get don't drink tea." She should have said no. The protocol for an anomalous habitation was to withdraw, secure the site from orbit, and file. The protocol did not include climbing the steps of a hut, past a sleeping apex predator, to sit at a table 3 spans, from a venom thing that made the burrowers change their route. Telluen climbed the steps. She could not have said, afterward, why. Part of it was the ledger keeper's disease, the need to see a thing fully before ruling on it, which had made her good at her work and lonely in it. Part of it was that the man had not been afraid, and she had spent 11 years being trained to be afraid of exactly this world, and his lack of fear was the single most disorienting fact of the morning. She wanted to know how a person came to sit with his back against a revenant's ribs and offer tea. Bishop's eye opened again as she came level with the doorway. She froze on the top step with one foot lifted. The eye was the size of her 2 hands together, gold, the pupil a hard black slot, and it did not blink, and it did not narrow, and it did not do any of the things her body had spent its whole life learning to run from. It simply looked at her, measured her, the way she measured worlds, and then it looked at Jonah, who had gone inside and was doing something domestic with a pot, and then it looked back at her, and Telluen understood, in the cold, clear way you understand the important things, that the beast had just asked its human a question and been answered, and the answer had been she's fine. The eye closed. "He's fine," Jonah called from inside, a beat too late to be useful. "Mind the sill on your left." Telluen minded the sill. She stepped over the threshold, over the curled forelimb, into the warm dark of the hut where a human had made a home on a world that killed everything. And behind her, out on the ash, her pilot's voice came thin through the open channel in her ear, saying her name, saying it again, saying, "Assessor, respond, is the site secure? "Is the site secure?" And she reached up and very gently turned him off. The inside of the hut was one room, and it was warm, and it was clean in the particular way of a place kept by a person who has nothing to do at night but keep it. There was a fire in a stone box against the far wall, drawing well. There was a bunk made. There was a table built from a hatch cover, 2 stools, a shelf of dented tins, a rack of tools each hung on its own nail. A rifle stood in the corner, and Tellurian's eye went to it the way an assessor's eye goes to the one object that contradicts the room, and she saw a skin of undisturbed dust across the stock, and she understood that it had not been fired in a long time, and that this told her something she did not yet have the frame to hold. Jonah set a tin cup of something pale and bitter-smelling in front of her. "It's not tea," he admitted. "It's the closest I've got. Root off a thing that grows down by the black water. Bishop showed me where." "The apex form showed you which plants are safe to consume," Tellurian said, very carefully, because she wanted it on the record and she wanted to hear herself say it and disbelieve it. "He didn't sit me down and teach me." Jonah lowered himself onto the other stool. Through the doorway his great animal filled the light, breathing. "First winter I was going to eat something I dug up. He got between me and it, just stood there, wouldn't move. I've got a healthy respect for a thing that big deciding I shouldn't do something, so I didn't." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, a small habitual motion. "Watched what he ate after that, ate that instead. Here I am." Tellurian lifted her own cup and did not drink it. Her heart had steadied. The fear had not left, it would not leave, not that day, not for many days, but it had settled into something she could work behind, the way you work behind a wound once you know it will not kill you in the next breath. "Mr. Reeve," she said, "I need to understand what I am looking at because I am going to have to write it down, and when I write it down a great many things are going to happen, to you and to this world, and I would like to write it down correctly." She set the cup on the exact center of the table. This world was ruled lifeless. It was not a careless ruling. My predecessors were thorough people. They found a biosphere at war with itself. Every form here predatory, no stable ranges, nothing that would hold still long enough to be called an ecosystem. They ruled that no organized life could persist. And then a human filed a homestead writ on it for almost nothing because the ruling made it worthless. She looked at him. "And now there is a fire and a full ring of life around it and an apex predator sleeping in your door. So I will ask you plainly, what did you do?" Jonah was quiet for a while. Outside, one of the girls came halfway up out of the turned earth by the trough, a low dark shape all shoulders and digging claws, drank, looked at the flyer at the edge of the markers, and sank back down without a sound. "I didn't do anything," Jonah said. "That's the part nobody's going to believe, so I'll say it first. I didn't tame them. I didn't feed them into it. I didn't win anything." He nodded at the rifle and its dust. "I shot at exactly one thing my first month here, missed it, and decided the noise wasn't worth what it cost me in sleep. After that I just kept house." He said it plainly, the way another man might say, "I kept books," or "I kept bees." Built the roof so it'd shed. Built the fire so it'd draw. Dug the trough because the black water's a long walk and I'm lazy. Made a dry, warm, quiet place and kept it dry and warm and quiet and didn't leave. "That is not an explanation," Tellurian said. "No," Jonah agreed, "but it's what happened." He leaned back. Bishop's breathing moved him half a span and settled him again. "You ruled this place a slaughterhouse and you were right. Everything here kills everything. There's no den on this whole world that's safe because whatever digs it, something bigger comes and takes it. Nothing rests. Nothing gets to stop." He looked at the fire. "I built the first place on this world where a thing could stop. That's all a home is, when you get down under everything else people pile on top of it. It's the place you're allowed to stop watching the dark." He shrugged. "Turns out that's worth more here than anywhere. Turns out that's the one thing this whole world never had, and I brought it in a hauler and nailed it to the ground, and they came in out of the cold, one at a time, to have it." Tellurian looked at the ring on her scanner, the dense, impossible warmth of it, All of it turned inward toward a stone box of fire and a young human who did not raise his voice. "They did not come to be near you," she said slowly, working it out. "They came to be near the stopping." "They came for the porch," Jonah said. "I just happened to be on it." She stayed the whole day. She told herself it was thoroughness. She recorded and she measured, and she filled the survey log with the kind of detail that would make the ruling unassailable, because she had already grasped that the ruling was going to be attacked hard by people who needed the world to stay dead. But under the thoroughness was something she did not have an assessor's word for, and it kept her on the porch through the long white afternoon. The plain astonishment of watching a system that could not exist run itself smoothly 6 spans from her feet. She watched a digger, one of the girls, come up at midday and lie in the sun with its terrible claws folded, and she watched Pin, the small drab venom thing, walk the length of the windowsill and around the frame and back, unhurried, and she watched the digger track it with a wariness that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with instinct. And she understood that the hut had a hierarchy, and that the hierarchy was real, and that the largest thing in it was not at the top. She watched rafter unfold from the eaves near dusk, a long membranous thing, all angles and hooks, that dropped without a sound and swept once around the ring at the height of a running person and folded itself back up in a different beam. Nothing on the plane moved for a full minute after. She marked the time. She would learn later that this was the evening perimeter, and that the aliens studying her recordings would give it a solemn name, and that she would let them, because there was no honest word for it that did not also sound absurd. And she watched Jonah. She watched him do his rounds at the failing of the light, check the flue, top the trough, walk the line of stakes with his hands in his coat pockets, push the leaning one straight. She watched him stop at the 3rd stake from the gate, the one over the turned earth, and crouch, and say something quiet down into the dark, and she watched the ground move gently in answer, like breath under a blanket. She watched him knock the side of the kettle twice with a spoon before he brought it in, tang, tang, small and flat and carrying. And she watched, all across the darkening ring, ears and eyes turned toward the sound and then away, reassured, the way a nursery settles when a door is heard to close. "What is that?" she asked him. "The kettle." "That?" He looked at the spoon in his hand as if he'd forgotten it was doing anything. "First winter I'd knock the pot to get the ash to settle. They learned the sound meant the fire was banked and I was in for the night. Now if I don't do it they get restless." He set the kettle on the box. "It's not a signal. It's just a habit that turned into one. Everything out here's like that. You do a small thing enough times and it stops being a small thing." Telluen wrote the kettle is a habit that turned into a signal in her log, and looked at the words, and felt the ground of her whole profession move under her, gently, like breath under a blanket. She filed at midnight from the cutter, in orbit, with the ring of light still burning on the dark face of the world below her. She filed it clean and complete and unhedged, because that was the only way she knew how to file, and because she had decided somewhere in the long afternoon that whatever else happened she was not going to be the assessor who softened it. Null seal in error. Sarat supports a persistent, organized, apex-inclusive biosphere, currently stable within a discrete range centered on a human habitation. Recommend immediate suspension of all salvage instruments pending full reassessment. Recommend protective interdict. She attached the spectra, the recordings, the slow, enormous pulse of the Revenant's heart lying peaceful in the middle of it all. She signed it. She sent it. The reply came back in 9 hours, which was fast, which was the first sign of how much money was involved. It did not come from the registry. It came from the Salvage Directorate, and it was not a question. It was a citation. Assessor Vaux, 3rd grade, is advised that null listing 7 Sarat is encumbered under Salvage Writ 40 having, executed and paid, and that any reassessment materially affecting the encumbrance must be adjudicated before the Directorate prior to entry in the registry. Assessor is advised that fabricated or exaggerated life findings entered to void a paid writ constitute instrument fraud. A directorate specialist will attend the site to verify. Assessor is advised to secure and preserve the site as found and to make no further entries. Telluen read it twice. She looked down at the burning ring on the dark world. They think I'm lying, she told the pilot. Are you? He said, not unkindly. Because it does sound like a lie. A man and a fire and every monster on a death world sitting around him like it's a hearth. If I hadn't seen it, I'd file you for fraud. That's the problem, Telluen said. It sounds exactly like the kind of story a species tells about itself. The small brave thing that tames the dark. Except it isn't a story and he didn't tame anything, and the more I try to write it plainly, the more it reads like a legend. She turned from the glass. They're not sending a specialist to verify. They're sending one to explain it away. And when he can't. She stopped. When he can't, the pilot said. Then it stops being about the ledger, Telluen said, and starts being about the writ. And people who have paid for a dead world do not like to be told it's alive. The specialist arrived 4 days later in a black lander with the directorate's mark on the flank, and he came down the ramp already talking, already certain, and Telluen disliked him inside the first sentence. Pression field, he said, before he had reached the bottom of the ramp, before he had properly looked at anything. He was a small twitching creature of a species she knew as Velt, quick and clever and built entirely of confidence, with a harness of instruments slung across a narrow chest and a scanning wand already lit in one hand. It's a suppression field, or a pheromone lure, or a neural inhibitor keyed to the local forms. Some cheap deathworld tech the human bought off a scrapper. I've seen it 3 times. It fools the life skin, it fools the eye, and it holds until it doesn't. He swept the wand at the hut without looking at the hut. Specialist Iman Drell, Directorate Ethology. Where's the operator? I want his emitter. There is no emitter, Telluen said. There's always an emitter. Drell brushed past her, toward the markers, toward the hut, toward Bishop lying enormous and slate-gray across the door in the late morning light. He got within a span of the 3rd stake before some animal part of him caught up to the front of him, and he stopped, and the wand in his hand began to shake, very slightly, and the readout on it filled with warmth from the turned ground at his feet, and he looked down, and for the first time since the ramp he was quiet. Mr. Reeve is on the porch, Telluen said. I would suggest you not step over the stake line without being asked. Jonah watched the small alien argue with the ground for a while before he said anything. Drell had recovered from the first fright the way clever people do, by talking faster. He was crouched now at the edge of the markers with 3 instruments planted in the ash, running a sweep, narrating it, no field harmonic, no pheromone signature, no broadcast on any inhibitor band, which means it's shielded, which means it's good, which means he paid real money for it. And Bishop had opened both eyes to watch him, and had not moved otherwise, and the not moving was doing more to the specialist's composure than a charge would have. There's no machine, Jonah said. Everyone says that. Drell didn't look up. The clever ones believe it, even. You'd be amazed what a man will convince himself he did with kindness when it was really a 200-credit emitter under the floor. He planted a 4th instrument. I'm going to prove there's a machine holder, and then I'm going to prove your ring is a machine's ring and not a life finding, and then the directorate is going to strip this rock down to the mantle like it paid to, and you're going to be relocated to a station somewhere with a stipend and a story no one believes. So, where's your generator? Under the fire. They usually put it under the fire. Under the fire's a fire, Jonah said. You're welcome to dig if Bishop lets you, which he won't. We'll see what he lets me do. Drell stood, brushing ash from his harness, bright-eyed and pleased with himself, and turned toward the trough where one of the girls had come up to drink in the sun. I don't need the whole system. I need 1 specimen off the emitter's leash for a controlled interval. I tag it, I walk it out past the field edge, and either it stays calm, which proves it's really pacified and you've got a rare temperament, congratulations, or it reverts the instant it clears the emitter and tries to open me up, which proves the machine. He unclipped a slim dark caster from the harness. Either way, I get my data. This one'll do. Nice and slow, out in the open. I wouldn't, Jonah said. He said it the way he'd said he's fine to Telluen on the step, flat, unbothered, a man reporting weather. But Telluen, who had spent 4 days learning to read the smallnesses of him, heard the difference. This was not reassurance. This was the last thing he was going to say about it. You wouldn't, Drell repeated, amused, citing the caster. You've got a lot of opinions for a squatter. The digger, one of the girls, the one Jonah thought was the young one, lifted her blunt head from the trough and looked at the specialist, mild, dripping, and Drell's finger found the stud. Relax, hold her. It's a sedative. She won't feel a thing. And when she wakes up past the line and takes my arm off, you can tell your assessor friend I told you S. Pins on your instrument, Jonah said. Telluen did not see how it happened, and afterward she was glad she hadn't. She saw the before. The specialist crouched, confident, the caster up, the digger watching him with an animal patience. The small drab venom thing that had been folded on the windowsill no longer on the windowsill. The fourth instrument planted in the ash by Drell's foot, and on the flat top of it, in a patch of sun, a soft brown banded shape no longer than a finger, folded up small and warm, occupying the one span of the specialist's careful array that the specialist most needed to reach. She saw Drell go still. She saw the confidence drain out of him like water out of a cracked cup. She saw him understand, without being told, exactly what was sitting on his instrument, and exactly what the distance was between his hand and it, and exactly what would happen if he moved wrong. And she watched a creature who had swaggered down a ramp 40 minutes ago become, in the space of one held breath, a thing made entirely of the wish to not be there. Don't, he whispered, to the venom thing, to all of it. Don't, I'm going to stand up. I'm just going to stand up and walk back to the ramp. That be my advice, Jonah said from the porch, not having moved. Drell stood up. He left the instruments where they were. He left the dark caster in the ash. He walked backward, one careful reed limb at a time, all the way to the black lander, and Pin sat on his abandoned scanner in the sun, and did not so much as unfold. And the digger went back to her water, and Bishop shut his eyes, and the whole ring exhaled and settled and went on being a home, and the specialist stood at the foot of his own ramp shaking so hard his harness rattled. Telluen retrieved his instruments for him. She had to. He would not cross the line again, not for his data, not for his career, not for anything. She lifted them one by one out of the ash, leaving the one with Pin on it, which she was not fool enough to touch, and which Jonah collected an hour later with a gloved hand, and a patience she declined to watch, and she carried them to the ramp and set them at the specialist's feet. There's no emitter, she told him, is there? Drell looked at the instruments. He looked at the hut, at the fire smoke, at the great slate shape in the door. He was directorate. He had come to prove a machine, and proving a machine was the entire reason the directorate had led him near a sealed world, and Telluen watched him weigh what he had seen against what he had been sent to find, and watched the fear lose to something worse than fear, which was arithmetic. There has to be one, he said quietly. You understand that, there has to be. Why, Telluen said. Because if there isn't a machine, Drell said, then he did it, and if he did it, then the world's alive. And if the world's alive, he stopped. He picked up his instruments with shaking hands. You don't understand how much RIT 40 is worth, Assessor. You genuinely do not. There is not enough truth in the galaxy to outweigh what that RIT is worth. So there has to be a machine, and I am going to go back and I am going to file that there is a machine, because the alternative is that a human and a campfire broke something that a great many powerful people have already spent. And no one wants to be the specialist who confirmed that. He went up the ramp. The black lander sealed and lifted and dwindled, and was gone into the flat blue. Telluen stood in the ash between the markers and the sky, and understood that the truth had just been shot down cleanly in front of her by a frightened man with a career, and that this was going to keep happening, at every level, all the way up, because the world being alive was more expensive than the world being dead, and expense had a gravity of its own that bent even light. "He's going to say there was a machine," she said. "Course he is," Jonah said. He'd come down off the porch to collect the dart caster, and he broke it open as he spoke and shook the sedative dart out into his palm and looked at it, mild. "Easier for everybody. I'm not in this for the registry assessor. I filed a writ and I built a house. If they want to say a machine did it, let them. The girls don't read filings." "They will come back," Telluen said. "Not a specialist next time. The writ is worth too much. They will send something that does not walk backward." Jonah closed his hand around the dart. "Then they'll come back," he said, and knocked the ash off the flue with the flat of his hand twice out of habit, and went in to bank the fire. The recordings got out. Telluen never learned exactly how, a clerk with a side income, a junior assessor who thought the world had a right to know, a leak from inside the directorate itself meant to make her look like a fabulist. It did not matter. Within a span of days, her survey logs of Sarat were being watched on 100 worlds, and the thing she had feared began to happen. The plain facts, played back, did not look plain at all. They looked like scripture. She watched a copy of her own recording with the sound the public had added to it, and did not recognize her work. Someone had scored the evening rounds like a right. Someone had slowed the moment Bishop's eye opened and closed at her on the step, and captioned it "The Beast Asks, the Man Answers." Someone had taken Jonah knocking the kettle, tang, tang, and cut it against the whole ring of animals turning toward the sound, and titled the clip "The Calling," and it had been watched more times than the entire prior output of the conquered Registry of Worlds. The ethologists were the worst, and they were serious people, and that was what made it worst. A body of xenobehavior scholars on a research moon published, in earnest, a monograph on the Sarat habitation, and in it they gave the man's habits names, because naming was what their discipline did, and the names were absurd and they were not wrong. The evening perimeter rafter flew, the single silent sweep at dusk after which nothing on the plain moved, they called second watch. The kettle knock they entered into the literature as the calling of the banked fire, and argued for 6 pages about whether it was a signal deliberately taught or an emergent convention, and concluded, correctly, that it was neither, that it was a habit that had become a signal because a habit repeated long enough on a world with no rest becomes law. The turned earth over the burrow, the leaning stake Jonah pushed straight each morning, the quiet word he said down into the dark. They called that the standing of the stake, and a Marine order 3 sectors away, hearing of it, adopted a version of it as a watch change ritual, and did not know why it made them feel safe, only that it did. The kibble, there was no kibble. There was Jonah scattering the inedible parts of what he dug in the same spot at the same hour, so the scavenging forms had a reason to keep the near ground clean. The scholars called the offering of the circle, and Telluen, reading it, put her head in her hands, because it was pompous and reverent and ridiculous, and because it was also, in every particular, true. "They've made a religion out of you doing chores," she told Jonah on her next descent. She had taken to descending. She told the registry it was to preserve the site. It was not entirely that. Jonah read the monograph she'd brought on the reader's slate, sitting on his porch step with Bishop's flank at his back, and he read it for a long time, and Telluen could not tell what he thought until he handed it back and said, "The offering of the circle." He shook his head slow. "It's a compost heap. I throw the guts on the compost heap so the little ones stop dragging them under the house. If they knew it was a compost heap, they'd be so disappointed." He looked out over the ring, over the warm ground and the drinking digger and pin folded on her sill. "Let them have the fancy words. Might be the words keep some of them from coming here to see it for themselves. Fewer visitors the better. The girls don't like night visitors." He said the last part twice that season. Telluen marked it, the way she marked everything now. The girls don't like night visitors. She did not yet know it was a warning. The pressure came up through the ledger, which was where she could see it, and through channels she could not, which was where it did the real work. RIT 40 having, she learned, was not a small salvage claim on a dead rock. It was a keystone. The directorate had bundled Sarat into a package of 11 null listings and borrowed against the lot, and sold shares in the borrowing, and those shares were held by people who held other people's shares, all the way up into the kind of altitude where a single word like inhabited could bring a great deal of weight down on a great many heads. If Sarat was alive, RIT 40 was void. If RIT 40 was void, the package was short one keystone, and the borrowing was undersecured, and the shares were worth less than the people holding them had promised other people they were worth, and the whole patient tower of it leaned. So the tower did what towers do. It did not argue that the world was dead. It argued that the assessor was unreliable. The first filing questioned her methods. The second questioned her spectra. The third, and this one had real hands behind it, careful ones, questioned her conduct, and attached a log of her descents, her hours on the site, her disabled channel, her tin cup of not tea, and framed it all as an assessor who had gone native on a sealed world and could no longer be trusted to rule on it. They did not accuse her of fraud outright. They did something more effective. They suggested, gently, in the reasonable voice of people protecting an investment, that she had been charmed. "They're going to pull you," the pilot said, reading it over her shoulder in the cutter. "You know that. Charmed assessor, compromised site, reassigned to a clean pair of eyes. A pair of eyes that hasn't had the tea. A pair of eyes the directorate picks," Telluen said. "That's the idea." Telluen looked down at the world. It was late morning over the hut. She could see the smoke. "Then I need the ruling entered before they pull me," she said. "Once it's in the registry proper under seal, it takes a full quorum to reverse. A filing they can bury. An entered ruling they'd have to fight in the open, and they don't want it in the open because in the open people would look, and they can't afford people to look." She began to compose. "I file the reassessment now. Complete. Interdict recommended. And I make it impossible to bury by making it impossible to disbelieve." "And how," the pilot said, "do you make a legend impossible to disbelieve?" Telluen thought of the specialist walking backward down the ash, of the truth shot down clean by a man with a career. "You don't," she said. "You make it impossible to ignore. There's a difference, and the difference is the writ. So I stop arguing that the world's alive." She keyed the record. "And I start arguing that the writ's already been tested. By someone who didn't file, and didn't survive too." She meant it as rhetoric. She was wrong too. The test had already come, days before, and Jonah simply hadn't mentioned it, the way he didn't mention whether that had already passed. She learned of it because the scaver skiff was still there. It sat a quarter-span east of the markers, out on the flat gray ash, when she made her descent, an ugly patched independent hull, hatches standing open, ramped down, a thing built for landing quiet and lifting heavy. There was a winch on it rigged for hauling a large specimen. There were cages. There was a rack of the long, cruel poles that trophy crews used on deathworlds, the kind with a loop and a charge, for taking a live apex off its feet from a distance. There was, in short, everything a crew would bring to a sealed world if they'd heard that a squatter was sitting on a fortune in unpoached apex forms, with nothing but a fire to protect them. There was no crew. Telluen walked the skiff with her scanner and found it empty and undamaged and provisioned for 6, with 6 sets of gear and 6 bunks slept in and 6 meals half-eaten and going hard on a fold-out table, and not one living thing aboard, and no sign of struggle and no sign of leaving, and the hatches open to the flat blue sky. She found Jonah on the porch, doing something ordinary to a length of rope. "There's a scavenger craft east of your markers," she said, "rigged for taking live specimens, provisioned for 6, empty." Jonah said, and made a turn in the rope. "Mr. Reeve." He set the rope down. He looked out east, past the markers, to where the ugly skiff sat with its cruel poles and its open hatches, and when he spoke it was without heat, without pride, without anything Telluride could hang a horror on, which was the horror. "They came 3 nights ago," he said. "Set down out there, quiet with the running lights off. I saw them on the flue camera. I rigged a camera to the flue first year so I'd see where they're coming." He turned the spoon over on the table, a small habitual motion. "I knocked the kettle early that night, banked the fire, did my rounds, said the word at the stake, went to bed." He looked at her. "I didn't do anything, Assessor. I want to be clear about that because you're going to write it down and it matters that you write it right. I didn't send anything. I don't send them anywhere. I went to bed." "And in the morning?" "In the morning the skiff was still there and nobody was on it." He picked the rope back up. "They came onto the warm ground in the dark, 6 of them with poles for taking Bishop off his feet, and the girls don't like night visitors." He made another turn in the rope, even unhurried. "I told you that. I've been telling you that. It's the truest thing I know about this place. Everything here spent 1,000,000 years learning that the dark is when the taking happens. And then one of them finally had a place worth keeping, and 6 strangers walked into it in the dark with cages." He tied the rope off. "You want to know why the world was ruled a slaughterhouse? Because it is one. I didn't change that. I just gave the slaughter something it never had before, which is a reason to point outward instead of in." Telluride looked east at the empty skiff, and she understood that she had come to the edge of a thing she was not going to be allowed to see, and that this was mercy, and that the mercy was the whole design of it. The niche of it. The niche did not show her the dark. It showed her the morning, and the empty hatches, and a young man tying off a rope, and let her fill in the rest with the entire weight of what she now knew the world to be. 6, she said. "I'd have warned them," Jonah said. "If they'd come in daylight and hailed, I'd have warned them, same as I warned the little clever one about Pin. But they came in the dark with the lights off to take a thing out of its home." He stood and knocked the ash off the flue twice and looked at the sky where the black water met the flat blue. "You can't warn a man who's decided to come in the dark. He's already told you what he thinks of the place. All you can do is let him find out he was wrong about how safe it is." He went in to put the kettle on. She almost didn't descend. The day she found out the home worked both ways. Telluride had come down meaning only to leave a supply drop at the markers. She had taken to bringing things the frontier didn't sell, small useful things, and telling the registry it was site maintenance, which it was not, and she saw from the air that the smoke was wrong. Thin. Low. A fire not tended so much as surviving, banked days too long and burning down to the last of itself, and no figure in the yard, and no bucket at the trough, and the whole ring pulled in tight and dark the way it had been that first season before the green, tight and watchful and afraid. She sat down fast and crossed to the markers, and there she stopped, because the ring did not know her that day. It knew her by then. 4 seasons of descents. The girls drank while she watched. The young one had once fallen asleep in her shadow. But that day, with the smoke wrong and the keeper nowhere, the ring came up hard and close and turned its whole attention on her at the stake line. The girls surfacing shoulder to shoulder, rafter dropping low in the eaves and staying dropped, Bishop filling the doorway not lazy and half asleep, but risen, up, his great head level and his slotted eyes fixed on her with none of the bored dismissal she had earned across a year. And Telluride stood at the line of sticks with her supply crate in her arms, and understood that for the first time since the first morning she was being weighed, and that she did not know the verdict, and that the thing weighing her was between her and a door for a reason. "Mr. Reeves," she called. "Nothing, Jonah." A sound from inside the hut, weak. A man surfacing from somewhere deep. "'S fine," Jonah's voice came, cracked thin. "She's fine. Assessor, come mind the doorway, he won't move, just come around the—" And then a cough that went on too long, and Telluride's hearts went cold, because she had heard that kind of cough in a hatchery infirmary, and it did not belong in the chest of the one steady thing on a deathworld. He had cut his hand 3 days before, gutting roots. A small, clean cut that on a supported world would have been nothing. And out here at the frozen edge of the season, it had gone bad the way small things go bad when there is no one to tell you to see to them. By the time Telyun got past Bishop, who did not move from the doorway, who led her over his forelimb with his eyes on her the whole way, weighing her still, keeping the cold out with his own body across the threshold. Jonah was on the bunk, gray-faced and burning, the cut hand swollen to the wrist, the fire banked down to coals, because for 2 days he had been too far gone to feed it, and had banked it as low as it would hold so it would not go out while he could not tend it. "Should have hailed you," he rasped, when she had the medical kit from her crate open and its reader against the wound. "Didn't want the fuss, thought I'd sweat it out." He almost laughed, which cost him. Turns out there's a limit to what a man can do out here on his own after all. "Who'd have guessed?" "You are not on your own," Telyun said, running the kit, watching it flag the infection and load the counteragent, her careful hands doing what they knew while the rest of her caught up. "You have not been on your own in 4 years. Hold still." "The girls kept the ground," Jonah murmured, eyes closing while the agent went in. 3 days I couldn't walk the line, they kept it anyway. Didn't do my rounds for me, they can't, they don't work that way. But they kept close, pulled in tight. Bishop wouldn't leave the door. His gray face turned a fraction toward the great slate shape filling the light. "Cold snap like this, the door standing open on a fever that kills you out here, the cold does before the wound gets the chance." He knew it. Lay in the door 3 days and kept the weather out with his own back. Didn't eat, wouldn't, the ghost of the flat, dry voice. "I made a warm place for them to stop watching the dark. First time I couldn't watch it myself, they watched it for me. That's not loyalty. Don't write loyalty, that's a people word, it's too small. It's just the home keeps whoever can't keep themselves. That's what it's for. Turns out that's what I built. I just always figured I'd be the one doing the keeping." Telyun stayed 4 days, which was a violation of a dozen protocols, and she fed the fire, and she ran the kit twice a day, and she watched the swelling go down and the gray leave his face, and she learned in the doing of it the last thing she had needed to learn about the place and had not been able to see from the outside. She had thought the home ran outward, the keeper at the center, providing, defending, and the animals arranged around him like warmth around a coal. And it did run that way most of the time. But it was not a wheel with a hub. It was a fire, and a fire does not care which stick is burning. A fire cares that the fire holds. When the keeper's stick burned low, the others closed around the low place and held the fire until it could catch again. Not for him, exactly. Not out of any people word he'd been right to refuse. But because a thing that has finally been allowed to stop watching the dark will keep the place that lets it stop. And the keeper, when he was down, was simply the part of the place that needed keeping. Bishop lay in the door all 4 days. He let Telyun come and go over his forelimb, weighing her a little less each time, until on the 4th morning, with Jonah sitting up and cursing weakly at the state of the woodpile, the great head went back down across the threshold, and the slotted eyes half closed, and the revenant went back to being the lazy, warm wall she had known, the weighing done, the verdict in. She was one of the ones who fed the fire when the keeper couldn't. That was a category the ring understood. It was, she thought, the only category any of them truly kept, not friend, not threat, not human or animal or apex or assessor, but feeds the fire and does not, and everything else was detail. "You'll want to hail me next time," she told him on the 4th day, packing the kit. "Before the fire goes low enough that the door has to stand open, and a monster has to lie in it 3 days to keep you from freezing." He didn't eat, Jonah. 4 years the strongest thing on the world, and it lay in a cold doorway, and starved a little to keep the weather off a man with a cut hand. "I would rather you hail me." Jonah looked at Bishop in the door, gray at the muzzle even then, before the years had made it grayer. "I'll hail you," he said, which was as close to thank you as the man came, and meant it the same way Bishop lying in the door had meant it, which was completely and without a single word for it. "There's not tea in the second tin. You've earned the good one. Bishop showed me where it grows." He eased back against the wall, mending kept. Sit down before you fall down, Assessor. You've been the color of the sky for 4 days. Let the fire do its work on you a while too. That's what it's for. That's the whole of what it's for. She sat, the fire drew, high and warm and holding. Outside the door, the world's apex predator kept the cold out with his back, and the girls kept the ground, and somewhere on the sill, a small drab deadly thing folded itself in the last of the light. And the home kept them all, keeper and kept alike. The way it had been built too, and the way no survey would ever have a column for, because the ledger measured everything about a world, except whether anything on it was allowed, at the end of a hard day, to stop. Telluen entered the ruling at dawn, from orbit, under her own seal, before anyone thought to stop her. It went into the registry proper, not a filing this time but an entry, the kind that took a full quorum to reverse, and it said, in the flat unhedged language she had built her life on, that null listing 7 Sarat was in error, that the world supported a persistent apex-inclusive biosphere, that the biosphere was stable, that a lawful human homesteader was present under valid writ, and that the world was therefore protected under the interdict statutes, and that all salvage instruments encumbering it were, by operation of that entry, suspended. She read it back once before she committed it. Then she committed it, and sat in the cutter in the grainy light of the Terminator, and felt the particular hollow that follows a thing you cannot take back. The reply took 2 hours, which meant it had been written in advance. They pulled her. Reassignment order effective immediately, signed by 3 names she reported to and 1 she did not. She was to be relieved on site by a clean assessor, was to surrender her survey instruments and her site logs, and was to consider herself the subject of a conduct inquiry into whether her rulings on Sarat had been compromised by prolonged unsupervised contact with the site. It was all very reasonable. It was all very quiet. It was the tower, leaning back to True. Told you, the pilot said. He was not gloating, he looked tired. Clean pair of eyes. They'll enter a competing assessment, force the quorum, and the quorum stacked with people who owe the package. Your ruling holds a year, maybe 2. Then it doesn't. A year is a year, Telluen said. She was watching the world. A year is time for people to look. Nobody's going to look at a ledger entry. No, Telluen agreed. But they'll look at a war. She turned from the glass. Because that's the next thing that happens, isn't it? The interdict suspends the writ, but the writ holders have already spent the world. They can't unspend it. They can't wait a year for a quorum to give it back to them clean. So they'll take it back dirty before the interdict has teeth, and they'll write it up afterward as clearing a squatter off a hazardous null listing, which is a thing the directorate is entitled to do, and which no one will look at twice. She keyed the record one last time before they took her instruments. They're going to send a force to clear the site. Soon, before the ink dries. I want it logged that I said so. Jonah found the new one at the Black Water, 3 days after the assessor stopped coming, and he almost stepped on it. It was small, smaller than Pin, though nothing like Pin. A soft, blind pup thing of some digging form he didn't have a name for, curled in the reeds where the current had left it, too weak to burrow, too young to be alone. Its den had been taken, most likely. That was how it went out here. Something bigger came and took the den, and the young that couldn't run got left in the open, and the open was where the world did its work. Jonah crouched over it for a while. He was not a soft man. He'd have said so himself flatly if anyone had asked, which no one did out here. He had come to Sarat precisely because it asked nothing of him and let him ask nothing back. A whole world with no one on it to be responsible to, which had suited a young man who had found the being responsible to harder than he'd ever let on. He had not built the porch out of kindness. He'd built it out of laziness and cold, and the plain animal wished to stop watching the dark. The kindness had been an accident of the architecture. He knew that about himself and did not pretend otherwise. He picked the pup up anyway. It fit in one hand. Bishop's going to have opinions, he told it and carried it home. Bishop had opinions. The great head came up off the threshold when Jonah crossed the markers with the thing in his coat, and the slotted eyes fixed on it, and for a long moment the whole ring seemed to wait on the revenant's verdict. The girls up out of the ground. Rafter unfolded a hand's width in the eaves. Pin turned toward the door on her sill. This was the hierarchy Telluin had mapped and never understood. This was the thing being decided that decided things. Jonah did not argue with it. He'd learned better than to argue with it. He set the pup down on the warm stone of the hearth, in the light of the banked fire, and stepped back, and let the world's apex predator decide whether the newest, weakest, most useless thing on the porch was allowed to stop watching the dark. Bishop looked at the pup for a long time. Then he put his great maul of a head down across the threshold again, over the pup, between the pup and the door, between the pup and the dark, and shut his eyes and breathed, and the ring settled, and the girls went back to their water, and the porch had one more thing on it that was allowed to stop. There, Jonah said to no one and put the kettle on. It was not on the record. The assessor had stopped coming. There was no one to write it down that a young man had carried a dying thing in out of the cold, and a monster had agreed to keep it. It happened anyway. Most of the true things did. They gave the clean assessor to a prefect named Having, and Having came himself, which told Telluin, reading it later, from the inquiry desk they'd parked her behind, 3 transfers out, exactly how much Writ 40 was worth. Prefects did not ride down to null listings. Prefects sent instruments. That Having came in person, aboard a directorate cutter with a reclamation tender in escort, and a written enforcement complement aboard the tender, meant the tower had stopped trusting the quiet channels and had decided to settle the matter with its own hands before the interdict grew any. Telluin knew Having by reputation, which was the only way anyone knew a prefect. He was Korth, one of the heavy-plated peoples, slow and vast and patient, built like the salvage engines his directorate ran, and he had a reputation for a specific kind of thoroughness that his admirers called rigor and everyone else called by its right name. He had cleared squatters off contested rocks before. He had a procedure for it. The procedure did not involve tea. She was not supposed to have access to the deployment. She had access anyway, because a pilot who had once turned off a channel for her had never turned back in the directorate's files, and he fed her the tender's manifest through a side door, and she read it in the grim little inquiry office with her surrendered instruments in a box at her feet, and her hearts went cold. The tender carried a written enforcement section. It carried containment ordnance, not weapons for killing a world's biosphere, which would be illegal even against a null listing, but suppressants, foams, sonics, the tools for putting a large number of animals to sleep or to flight across a wide area, for clearing ground. It carried a relocation cell rated for a single humanoid, which was for Jonah, which meant they intended to take him alive and file him as a rescued squatter, which was worse in its way than the alternative, because a rescued squatter could be moved somewhere with a stipend and a story no one believed, and the world could be entered as cleared, and the ring could be dispersed, and the fire could be let go out. And in a season, there would be nothing on Sarat but the old flat gray line on the life scan, and the memory of a legend that the Registry had, regrettably, been forced to correct. They were not coming to kill anything. That was the clever part. They were coming to make the world lonely again and call it a rescue. Telluin looked at the manifest and looked at the box of her surrendered instruments, and did a thing she had never done in 400 worlds of careful service. She stopped being careful. "You can't go back," the pilot told her on the transit because he had come to, because some errors are worth making with company. "You're under inquiry. You set foot on that site, you hand them the conduct case gift-wrapped. Compromised assessor interferes with lawful clearance. That's your service over. That's a cell, maybe." "I'm not going back to interfere," Telluin said. She had the box of instruments open on her knees, checking each one, the ledger keeper's hands doing what they knew how to do while the rest of her decided what kind of creature she was going to be. "I'm going back to record." "That's still lawful, An assessor may witness a clearance and log it, and a log entered contemporaneously under seal is admissible even from an assessor under inquiry. They can throw out my rulings. They can't throw out what I write down while it's happening. She closed the box. Having's whole procedure depends on there being no honest record of it. A squatter cleared off a hazardous rock, no witnesses, written up after the fact. So I'm going to be a witness. I'm going to stand on that porch with a sealed recorder and log every legal step of it, and every step that isn't. And if he clears the site anyway, then the registry has an entry that says exactly how, in daylight, on the record, in my hand. And if it goes the other way, the pilot said. If it goes the way the scavers went. Telluin was quiet for a moment. She thought of the empty skiff, the open hatches, the young man tying off a rope. The girls don't like night visitors. Having's coming in daylight, she said. He's directorate. He'll do it by procedure in the sun on the record because that's what makes it a clearance and not a crime. She looked out at the stars sliding past. The trouble is, I don't think the ring knows the difference between a procedure and a poacher. I don't think the world cares what's written on the tender. I think it only knows that a great many strangers are about to walk onto the one warm place it has, to make it cold again. She was quiet. And I don't know what a home does, when enough strangers come to take it apart. I've never seen a home fight. My people don't have them. We have hatcheries and postings and the ledger. I came out here to rule on a dead world, and instead I have spent a season learning that I don't know the first thing about the most dangerous force in it, which is a young man who found somewhere he was finally allowed to stop, and every creature that stopped with him. The pilot flew on toward Sarat. Then let's go write it down, he said. Jonah was splitting fuel when the assessor's cutter came back down out of the flat blue, and he knew from the way it came, fast, low, no circle, no caution, that whatever she'd been away doing was over, and that the news was riding down with her. He set the maul down and wiped his hands and waited on the porch. Bishop lifted his head. The girls came halfway up out of the ground. Pin unfolded a fraction on her sill, which she did for very little, and Jonah marked it, because the small ones knew things before the big ones did, and Pin knowing something was worth more than a prefect's whole tender. Telluin came down the ramp too fast for her own careful body, stumbled on the ash, caught herself. She had a sealed recorder clipped to her chest and a box under one arm, and she had the look of a creature who had spent a long transit deciding to ruin herself. They pulled me, she said before she'd reached the markers. I'm under inquiry. My rulings entered, but they'll force a quorum to reverse it, and before the quorum they're going to clear the site. Today, tomorrow. A prefect named Having directorate with a reclamation tender and a written enforcement complement. They're not coming to kill anything. She stopped at the third stake, chest heaving, membrane gray. They're coming to make it lonely. To take you off in a relocation cell, put the animals to sleep and scatter them, let the fire go out and enter the world as cleared. A rescue, they'll call it. And they'll do it in daylight by procedure on the record, so no one can say it was a crime. Jonah listened to all of it without moving. Sit down before you fall down, he said when she was done. You're the color of the sky. Mr. Reeve. I heard you. He came down the steps and took the box from under her arm because she was going to drop it and set it on the porch. A prefect. A tender, they want to take me off and turn the fire out. He straightened. When? I don't know, soon. Hours, maybe. I flew straight from the transit. She gripped the stake, steadying. Jonah, I came back to record it. That's all I'm allowed to do, witness and log under seal. It's the one thing that might matter later, an honest entry of exactly what they do. But I need you to understand what I can and can't stop. I can't stop the clearance. I'm an assessor under inquiry with a box of surrendered instruments. I have no weight left. She looked at him, all her patient eyes at once. The only thing on this world with any weight left is the thing I came here 400 worlds ago never expecting to find, which is a home that fights. And I don't know what it does. Nobody does. So I'm asking you plainly, while there's still daylight and time to answer. What happens when the prefect comes? Jonah looked at the ring. He looked at Bishop in the doorway, and the girls at the trough, and Rafter folded in the eaves, and Pin on her sill, and the blind pup asleep on the warm hearthstone where the Revenant had put his own head between it and the dark. He looked at all of it, the whole impossible warm circle he had nailed to a dead world with a hauler and a fire and the plain refusal to leave. And when he spoke it was without heat, the way he said everything, and it was the truest thing Telluin ever heard him say. "Nothing happens," Jonah said, "if they come in daylight and hail and let me talk. And if they don't, then I'll do what I do every night," Jonah said. "I'll knock the kettle and bank the fire and do my rounds and go to bed, and the world will do what the world does to strangers who walk onto the warm ground in the dark to take it apart." He picked them all back up. "I don't send them anywhere, Assessor. I keep telling you that and you keep not writing it down. I go to bed. That's the whole of it. That's the terrible part and the true part both. I built a place worth keeping and filled it with things that spent 1,000,000 years learning to keep, and then I got out of their way." He set a length of fuel on the block. "You want it on your record. Write that. Write that the human did nothing, and that the nothing was the most dangerous thing on the world. Having came in daylight." Telluin gave him that, in her log, and meant it as neither credit nor blame, only fact. The Directorate cutter and its reclamation tender came down out of a hard noon sun, slow and vast and patient, and set down a careful quarterspan beyond the markers, engines throwing gray ash in a long fan, and the reinforcement complement filed out onto the flat in ordered ranks with their containment gear slung and their sonics cased and their foam lances racked, and not one of them, Telluin noted, carried a weapon rated to kill. It was all clearance gear. It was all lawful. It was, exactly as she'd feared, a procedure, and a procedure was the hardest thing in the galaxy to stop, because it had no single throat to reason with. The prefect came last because vast-plated things come last, and he came without hurry, a slow gray mountain of a Korth in the Directorate's deep colors, and he stopped at the markers at the stake line which he had been briefed on, which meant someone had watched Telluin's recordings closely enough to know where the yard ended and the world began, and he looked across the warm ground at the hut, at the fire smoke, at the young man on the porch with a monster in his door, and he spoke. And his voice through the translator was slow and even and almost kind. "Homesteader," Having said, "I am Prefect Having, of the Salvage Directorate, executing lawful clearance of null listing 7 Seret under Writ 40. You are recorded as a squatter on a hazardous sealed world. You are not in trouble. You are being rescued." A pause, patient. "You will gather what you can carry. You will walk to the tender. You will be relocated to a supported habitat with a settlement stipend, and this world will be returned to the condition in which it was found. This is not a negotiation, but it is not a cruelty either. It is a clearance. Do you understand what I have said?" "I understand it," Jonah said. "Good." Having's great head turned, unhurried, to take in Telluin standing at the porch with her sealed recorder lit. "Assessor Vox, you are under inquiry and present without standing. You may witness. You may log. You may not interfere. If you interfere, I will have you removed, and the removal will also be lawful and also on the record." He turned back to Jonah. "I am told you have made pets of the local forms. I am told there are recordings. I have watched them. I found them moving." He did not sound moved. He sounded like a mountain describing weather. "But a moving thing and a lawful thing are different things, Homesteader, and my writ concerns only the second. So, gather what you can carry." Jonah did not move to gather anything. "You came in daylight," he said. "You hailed, you let me talk." He set his hands in his coat pockets. "I want you to know I noticed that. It's more than the last crew did. So I'll do you the same courtesy they didn't earn. I'll warn you." He nodded once at the ground between them. "Don't cross the stakes." Telluin's recorder caught all of it, and she was grateful, later, that it had, because no memory she owned was steady enough to be trusted with what came next, and the log was the only thing that stayed level. Having looked at the stake line, it was not a fence. It was 5 hand-cut markers driven into gray ash, leaning at their small individual angles, the third one from the gate freshly straightened that morning. It was the least defensible boundary the prefect had ever been asked to respect, and Telluin watched him weigh it against a lifetime of clearances, against the writ, against the tender full of ordered troops behind him, and find it wanting, as of course he would, because he was directorate, and it was a line of sticks. Homesteader, having said almost gently, "I have cleared 40 worlds. I have been warned off better lines than that by better armed creatures than you." He lifted one vast plated limb and gestured his complement forward, a slow, patient sweep, the beginning of a procedure that had run smoothly 40 times. "Advance to the structure. Sedate the large form first. Contain the burrowers. Take the homesteader into the cell unharmed. Foam the pins off the sill," Jonah said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, the way a man notes that the wind has changed. And Telluin, who had learned the smallnesses of him across a season, looked instantly to the window of the hut, to the patch of sun on the sill, where a soft drab-banded thing had folded and unfolded through every conversation of that long strange season. And the sill was empty, and the patch of sun held nothing, and somewhere in the churned gray ash between the porch and the prefect's ordered ranks the deadliest thing on the whole world was no longer where anyone could see it. The complement had already stepped over the stakes. What happened when the complement crossed the stakes was that the ground opened, gently, all across the yard, and the world came up to look at them. Not a charge. Telluin's recorder was steady on it, and there was no charge, no rush, no snarl, nothing her people's nightmares had trained her to expect. There was only the ash lifting in a dozen quiet places at once as the girls rose out of the turned earth they'd kept clean all season, 6 of them, 7, the young one, and stood with their digging claws folded and their blunt heads level, and looked at the enforcers who had stepped onto the warm ground and did nothing else at all. In the eaves rafter unfolded slow to twice his length and hung there and did not drop. On the threshold Bishop rose, and that was the thing that stopped the complement dead, the sheer unhurried mass of him coming up off the ground he had claimed, slate-gray and enormous and calm. Calm, the great slotted eyes moving across the ordered ranks without heat, the way a man looks over stock and lay back down again, across the door between the strangers and the fire and shut his eyes. The message could not have been plainer if it had been written on the sky. They saw the intruders and were not afraid of them, and the strangers were standing in the middle of their home. The enforcers stopped, not on any order. They stopped the way living things stop when every instinct they own screams the same word at once, and the word is wrong, and the ranks that had crossed 40 worlds bunched and shuffled, and did not advance another span, and the foam lances came up but did not fire, because the creatures they were pointed at had not done anything. And there is no procedure in any manual for a threat that will not attack you, and will not run, and will only lie down in its doorway and watch you with its eyes half closed. Hold, having said from beyond the line, even the prefect had gone still. Hold your positions. Good advice, Jonah said from the porch. He had not moved. That was the thing Telluin's recorder caught that she came back to, again and again, in the seasons after. Through all of it the young man had not moved from the porch step, had not raised his voice, had not reached for the rifle standing in its dust in the corner behind him. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and Bishop's flank warm against the back of his legs, and he watched a prefect's complement discover, in daylight, what the scavers had discovered in the dark, with the one difference that mattered, which was that these ones were still alive to discover it, because the sun was up and no one had done anything yet. Prefect, Jonah said, here's where we are. Your people are on the warm ground. Mine are up. Pinned somewhere in the ash by your line, and I couldn't tell you where, and neither could you, and that's the whole problem in one sentence. He tipped his head. Nobody's done anything. That's the good news, and it's the only news, so I'd hang on to it. Back your people over the stakes, in daylight, slow, and everyone gets to keep finding out about this place from a distance, which is the only safe way there is to find out about it. One of them broke. Telluin never got the enforcer's name. It wasn't on any manifest she was given, and afterward the directorate was not in a sharing mood. He was young, she thought, young for whatever his people counted as young, near the front of the bunched ranks, close to Bishop, close to the diggers, with a foam lance up and shaking, and a mind that had walked past the edge of what it could hold. She saw it build. She saw the shaking travel up the lance. She saw the animal terror in him crest into the thing terror becomes when it can't run, which is aggression, and she opened her mouth to say something useless, and the enforcer fired. The foam lance was not a weapon rated to kill. It was a clearance tool, a wide gout of fast-setting suppressant foam, meant to bind an animal's limbs and pin it for containment, and he emptied it at Bishop from 6 spans, full charge, straight into the great slate flank, because Bishop was the largest thing and the nearest, and the terror needed somewhere to go. The foam struck Bishop's side and slid off it like water off stone. Bishop opened one eye, and that Telluin's recorder caught it, and her heart's nearly stopped on it. That was the moment the whole world could have turned. She felt it the way you feel a great weight shift on a slope. The girls' heads came around as one. Rafter dropped a body length in the eaves and caught himself. The ash by the line stirred where nothing should have been. Every calm thing in the ring stopped being calm in the same half-second. And for one held breath, the home that Telluin had spent a season failing to understand gathered itself to do the thing homes do when strangers come in the dark. Except it was not dark. It was noon, and the only thing standing between a prefect's compliment and whatever the scavers had found was a young man on a porch step with his hands in his pockets. "Leave it," Jonah said. He did not shout it. Telluin played it back 100 times and he never once shouted it. He said it the way he said everything, flat and unhurried and without heat. The way you'd tell a dog to leave a dropped scrap, the way you'd settle a thing that trusted you, 2 words, quiet, out across the ring. Leave it. And the ring left it. Bishop's eye closed. The girls' heads came level. Rafter folded back up into the beam. The ash by the line went still. The gathered weight let itself back down the slope, gently, all at once, and the world that had been half a heartbeat from answering a fired weapon simply didn't, because the man on the porch had told it not to, and the whole terrible fact of the season stood revealed in the ash under the noon sun. That the monsters had not been tamed, and had not been commanded to attack, and did not need to be, that the only order the young man ever gave them was leave it, and that his voice was the one catch on a loaded world, and he had just used it to keep a complement of the men who'd come to cage him alive. The enforcer who had fired dropped his empty lance and sat down in the ash and did not get up. Having looked at the foam sliding off Bishop's flank, and at the young man who had said leave it and been obeyed, and Telluin watched a prefect who had cleared 40 worlds do the arithmetic that the specialist had done, and the assessor had done, and the frightened enforcer had failed to do in time, and come out the other side of it changed. Back over the line, having said, all sections now slow, weapons down and cased, carry him. He meant the one sitting in the ash. Nobody runs, nobody turns his back, walk. They walked. It took a long time, and every span of it was the longest work those enforcers had ever done, walking backward off the warm ground under the half-closed eyes of things that could have ended them and had been told, by a stranger, not to. They got the sitting one under the arms and dragged him. They recovered the dropped lance. They crossed the stakes, one careful rank at a time, back onto the flat gray world where the lifeskin drew its old dead line, and not one creature in the ring moved to stop them or to follow, because the man on the porch had said leave it, and that was the beginning and the end of the law on Sarat. When they were all back across, Having did not lift for the tender. He stood at the markers, vast and gray and still, and he looked at the hut for a long while, and then he did a thing that was not in any procedure. He spoke to the homesteader as one apex to another, plainly, the pretense of clearance set down in the ash with the foam lance. I have cleared 40 worlds, having said. I have never been warned off one and been right to heed it. Today I heed it. A pause, slow. Explain it to me, homesteader. Not for the writ. The writ is finished. I knew it was finished when the foam ran off him and he closed his eye. Explain it so I understand what I am flying away from, because I am going to have to tell people why writ 40 is dead, and I would like, for once, to tell them the truth. Jonah was quiet a moment. Then he came down off the porch. The first time he'd moved from the step all day, and walked to his side of the stakes, and the two of them stood on either side of a line of leaning sticks, the plated mountain and the young man in the brown coat, and it was the most evenly matched Telluride had ever seen two creatures stand. You came to clear a squatter off a dead rock, Jonah said, but it was never a dead rock, and I was never the thing that mattered on it. Here's what you almost did. He nodded back at the ring, at Bishop, at the girls, at the pup asleep on the warm hearthstone. This world spent 1,000,000 years with every living thing on it trying to kill every other living thing, and nothing ever got to stop, and nothing was ever safe, and there was never once a place a creature could put its head down and not watch the dark. Then a lazy man built a fire and wouldn't leave, and for the first time in the history of this world there was a home, and they came in out of the cold to have it, one at a time, and they kept it, and they'll keep it against anything. He looked up at the prefect. You didn't come to clear a squatter. You came to walk into the one safe place on a world of apex killers and take away the one thing keeping the safe place safe, which is me and the word I say. You'd have got me into your cell, maybe. And then you'd have had a whole world of things that spent 1,000,000 years learning to keep, with nobody left to tell them to leave it. He turned and started back for the porch. You almost made this world lonely again, prefect. You have no idea how close you came, or how lucky you are that it was noon. Having stood at the line, a long time after that. Then the great gray head inclined, slow, the way a mountain would bow if a mountain could, and the prefect turned and walked back to his tender and gave the order to lift, and the reclamation complement rose off Sarat into the hard noon sun and did not come back. The tender's engines faded into the flat blue, and the ash settled, and the ring came down. Telluride stood on the porch with her recorder still lit and watched it happen the way you watch a held breath let go. The girls sinking back into the turned earth, Rafter refolding into his beam, Bishop lowering his great head across the threshold and letting out the long dust-stirring sigh that meant the day was over as far as he was concerned. On the hearthstone the blind pup had slept through the whole of it, warm, useless, kept, and Telluride looked at it for a long time and could not have said why her throat had gone tight. You should sit down, Jonah told her. You've been the color of the sky since you landed. She sat. He put the kettle on. Somewhere a bird she didn't have a name for, a real bird, the first she'd seen on Sarat, small and brown and ordinary, landed on the ridge of the salvaged roof and looked around at the warm circle and decided to stay. And Telluride marked it, because marking things was what she had left. He'll file it as a clearance anyway, she said, when the knot T was in front of her. He has to. He came with a tender and a writ and 40 worlds of reputation. He can't fly home and tell the directorate a line of sticks turned him back. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup. He'll write that the site was hazardous, the biosphere unstable, the clearance deferred on safety grounds, something with no throat in it. And the quorum will meet, and they'll reverse my ruling, and in a season there'll be another tender, and maybe that one comes at night, or maybe it doesn't come down at all. Maybe it just sits in orbit and denies the world to you from a distance until the fire's the only warm thing left, and then not even that. She was too tired to soften it. I entered the truth, Jonah. I ruined my service to enter it. And the truth is going to lose to the writ, because the writ is worth more, and that's the whole shape of the thing, all the way up. Jonah turned his cup a quarter turn on the table. Maybe, he said, but you're wrong about having. You don't know him. I know what a man looks like when the foam runs off, Jonah said. I watched him do the arithmetic. He's not going to file a clearance. He looked out east where the tender had gone. He asked me to explain it so he could tell people the truth. A man about to write a lie doesn't ask you for the truth first. He asks you for a story he can live with, having asked for the other thing. He set the cup down. I don't know if it'll be enough, but he's not the throat you're worried about. He's the first witness you've had who outranks the ones calling you charmed. Having did not file a clearance. Telluen learned it the way she learned everything now, from a pilot who had never turned back into the directorate's files. The prefect came off Sarat and did not enter the site as cleared, deferred, or hazardous. He entered a finding. It ran 4 lines, in the flat register of a creature who had spent his life clearing worlds and had just declined to clear one. And it said that the null listing of 7 Sarat was in error, that the world supported a stable apex biosphere organized around a lawful human habitation, that the biosphere would defend the habitation against removal by any means, and that in the professional judgment of the executing prefect, the writ was unenforceable, not on grounds of law but on grounds of fact, the fact being that there was no procedure by which the site could be cleared without a loss of complement the directorate could not sustain and should not attempt. He signed it. He attached Telluen's contemporaneous log to it, under his own seal, which gave an assessor under inquiry's witness the weight of a prefect's endorsement. And then he did the thing that made it a war instead of a filing. He entered a second finding, unasked, recommending that Writ 40 be voided in full, and that the 11-world package it anchored be reassessed for further errors of the same kind. He blew up the whole package, the pilot said, reading it to her across a bad channel. Not just Sarat. He put in writing that if Sarat was wrongly ruled dead, the other 10 might be too, and somebody ought to look. Do you understand what that does? It makes them look, Telluen said softly, at all of it. It makes them come for him, the pilot said, the same way they came for you. Charmed assessor, compromised prefect. They'll say Sarat broke his nerve. They'll say a squatter in a campfire spooked a man who cleared 40 worlds, and half of them will even believe it because it's easier than the alternative. A pause. The quorum's called, Telluen, to reverse your ruling and reinstate the writ. 8 seats. The package holders control 5 of them outright and can lean on a 6th. It's not going to be close. Telluen sat in the grim little inquiry office 3 transfers from anywhere, with the box of her surrendered instruments at her feet, and looked at the odds, and found that she was not afraid, which surprised her, and then understood why she was not afraid, which surprised her more. Then I'll go to the quorum, she said. You're under inquiry. You have no standing. They'll deny you the floor. An assessor under inquiry may not rule, Telluen said, but a witness may testify if a seated member calls her. She was already gathering the recorder, the log, the box, and Having's a prefect. Having can call whoever he likes. The quorum met in a hall on the registry's home moon, under a dome of pale glass that let the daylight in, and Telluen stood at the witness rail with her sealed recorder, and understood within the first hour that the pilot had been right. It was not going to be close. The package holder's counsel was good. That was the danger of him. He was not loud. He did not overreach. He did not deny that there was life on Sarat, because denying it now would have made the quorum look, and looking was the one thing the whole apparatus was built to prevent. Instead, he did something cleverer. He conceded the life and disputed the frame. No one contests that there are animals on 7 Sarat, he told the 8 seats, reasonable, unhurried. The question before this quorum is not whether the world holds life. Many hazardous null listings hold pockets of transient life. The statutes account for it. A pocket of life does not void a paid writ or trigger an interdict. The question is whether that life constitutes a persistent, organized biosphere within the meaning of the interdict statute. And on that question, the quorum has before it the assessment of Vaux, 3rd grade, an assessor presently under inquiry for prolonged compromised contact with the very site she assessed, whose ruling reads less like a survey and more, if the seats will forgive me, like a testimonial. A pause, delicate. She fell in love with a story honored seats. It is a very good story. A brave small creature, a fire in the dark, the monsters gentled by kindness. We have all heard some version of it since we were in the hatchery, but the interdict statutes were not written to protect stories. They were written to protect biospheres, and a season of one homesteader's pets, however charming, is not a biosphere. It is a menagerie, and a menagerie does not outweigh Writ 40. It was very well done. Telluin watched 3 of the seats settle back, relieved, because he had handed them the thing they needed, which was a way to reverse the ruling without seeming to look away from anything. A menagerie, not a biosphere. It would hold. It would reverse her ruling by dinner and reinstate the writ, and in a season there would be another tender, and this one would not come in daylight. Then having rose, slow and vast, and asked the quorum to call the assessor to the rail, and the seats, who could not deny a prefect, called her. Telluin did not argue that the world was alive. She had learned that lesson in the ash from a specialist walking backward. The truth of it was too large and too strange, and the larger and stranger the truth, the easier it was for frightened people to file it as a story and move on. So she did not fight the frame. She changed the category. Council is right, she told the 8 seats and watched them blink at that. It is not a biosphere, I withdraw the word. A biosphere is a system in balance, and Sarat has never been in balance a day in its existence. Council's own predecessors ruled it lifeless precisely because nothing on it would hold still long enough to be called a system. Every form predatory. No stable ranges. Nothing that would gather. They were not wrong. I have read their survey 100 times and every line of it is true. She let that sit. And it is still true. That is the part I need the seats to hold. The ruling of lifelessness was not a mistake of observation. It was a mistake of category. My predecessors looked at Sarat for the one thing the ledger has a column for, a biosphere, life in balance, and they did not find it because it was not there, and so they wrote lifeless, because the ledger gave them no other box to put it in. She keyed the recorder. The dome's daylight fell across the great pale wall, and on it she put the ring. The turned earth opening, the girls rising calm, Bishop lowering his head between the strangers and the fire, the foam running off his flank like water off stone, and a young man's flat 2 words, leave it, and a whole world of apex killers letting a slope of gathered weight back down because he had told them to. That is not a biosphere, Telluin said into the silence. Council is correct. It is not balance, and it is not a menagerie, and it is not a story. It is a thing the Registry has never once had a column for in all its history, and it does not have a column for it because, until a season ago, it had never existed anywhere in the surveyed galaxy, and it had never existed because it requires a species that builds the one thing none of the rest of us build. She looked at the 8 seats. A home, not a hive, not a hatchery, not a range or a den or a territory. A home, a place a creature is allowed to stop watching the dark, offered, held, and defended, across the lines of species, by nothing but the steadiness of the one who keeps it. That is what is on Sarat. That is what the human brought in a hauler and nailed to a dead world. And you cannot reverse it back into lifelessness, honored seats, because the moment you look at it honestly, the moment this recording enters the record and the galaxy looks with you, the word lifeless is finished. On Sarat and on every other null listing your writ holders have ruled dead by looking for the wrong thing. She stepped back from the rail. You can reinstate the writ. You have the seats. But you will be reinstating it in the open, over a prefect's finding and an assessor's log, and a recording that 10 billion people are going to watch. And the question they will ask is not whether Sarat is alive. It is why the Registry ruled a world lifeless when all it lacked was a home, and how many other worlds you have sold for scrap, because no one thought to build one. The quorum did not reverse her ruling. It did something the package holders found much worse. It flinched. Telluin watched it happen from the witness rail, in the pale daylight under the dome, and understood that she had won nothing and prevented everything, which on a bad day is the most an honest assessor can hope for. The council had the seats. He had always had the seats. What he no longer had, after the recording played across the Great Wall, was a way to use them quietly, and quiet was the whole of his instrument. 5 seats will reverse a ruling in a closed room without a second thought. 5 seats will not reverse a ruling with 10 billion people about to ask why, because the seats are held by creatures with names and postings and reputations, and none of them, when it came to it, wished to be the seat that voted to rule a home lifeless on the record. So they deferred. They called it further study. They impaneled a full survey, a real one this time, 6 teams, 2 years, to reassess 7 Sarat under a category to be determined, and they suspended, pending that study, all salvage instruments encumbering the world. It was framed as caution. It was, in fact, surrender, because a suspended writ earns nothing and a 2-year study is a slow public grave. And every seat in the hall knew it, and the council knew it best of all, and Telluin watched him gather his materials with the flat composure of a man who has just been beaten by the one weapon he brought to the field himself. "You wanted a menagerie no one would look at," she told him quietly at the rail when the seats had filed out. "You should not have made me play the recording. A menagerie no one looks at is a nuisance. A home 10 billion people have watched a monster defend is a monument. You built that. I only pointed at it." He inclined his head, because he was good, and because being good sometimes means knowing the exact moment you have lost. "The package is finished," he said. "You understand that, not just Sarat. Once they study Sarat honestly, they'll study the other 10 and they'll find homes on some of them too, because your homesteader isn't the only human who read null listing as cheap and sealed as left alone. There are 40 more writs like 40. There are 400. He closed his case. "You didn't save a world, assessor. You broke a market. Do you have any idea how many powerful people just lost a very great deal of money because a lazy man built a fire?" "Yes," Telluin said. "I've been counting them all season. That's why I stopped being careful." They came for the people after that, because the world was out of reach. It was the last move the tower had, and it was the oldest one. If you cannot untell a truth, you discredit the ones who told it. The conduct inquiry against Telluin, which had been drifting, sharpened overnight into something with teeth, findings drafted, a hearing scheduled, an argument assembled that an assessor who ruins a paid writ and befriends her subject and disables her channels and returns to a site under inquiry is not a whistleblower but a zealot, and that her rulings, all of them, going back years, should be reviewed for the same infection. They opened a parallel line against having. They let it be known, in the reasonable voices of people protecting an investment, that Sarat had broken 2 careful careers, and that this was itself evidence of how dangerous the place was, and that perhaps the kindest thing for everyone would be to quietly retire the assessor and the prefect both, and let the 2-year study be run by clean people, and let the whole strange season fade into the kind of story that gets shorter every time it's told. It was a good plan. It had worked before on quieter truths. It failed on this one for a single reason the tower had never planned for and could not have planned for, which was that the recording was already out, and the galaxy had already fallen in love, and the thing the directorate had spent a season trying to bury had become, in the 10 billion hands it reached, the one thing they could no longer touch. Because people had watched the foam run off Bishop's flank. People had heard a young man say leave it to a world of monsters and be obeyed. People 3 sectors away who would never in their lives see a deathworld had watched a revenant lower its head between strangers and a fire, and had felt, in whatever their species used for a chest, the plain enormous pull of it, the home, the stopping, the thing none of them built and all of them wanted. And when the tower moved to retire the assessor and the prefect who had defended that home, the 10 billion did the tower the one discourtesy it could not survive. They looked at the conduct inquiry and asked why an assessor was being disciplined for entering a true finding. They looked at the parallel line against having and asked why a prefect was being punished for declining to lose his compliment clearing a lawful home. They looked at Writ 40 and the package it anchored, and the 400 other null listings ruled dead by looking for the wrong thing, and they asked the question the council had known they would ask, the one no amount of seats could answer in the open. How many homes did you sell for scrap? The inquiry against Telluin was closed within the span. No finding. No apology either. The tower did not apologize, it simply stopped, the way a tide stops, and pretends it was never coming in. Haven's line closed a day later. The 2-year study went ahead because the seats had voted it, and the seats do not unvote, but everyone understood by then what the study would find, because the study was being run in daylight now, on the record, with 10 billion people reading over its shoulder, and you cannot rule a watched home lifeless. You didn't win, the pilot told Telluin, and he was right, and he was smiling when he said it. You just made it impossible to lose quietly, which, against these people, is the same thing. The word that could not be found became the word everyone used. That was the strangest of the harvests to Telluin, and the one she thought Jonah would have found funniest, if Jonah had been the kind of man who followed such things, which he was not. The registry had no column for what was on Sarat. It had ruled the world lifeless precisely because the ledger gave it no other box. And now, because 10 billion people had watched and would not look away, the registry did the one thing a bureaucracy hates above all others. It invented a new column. They argued for a year about what to call it. The ethologists wanted something grand and Latinate. The statute writers wanted something narrow enough to bound and broad enough to survive appeal. The directorate, what was left of its influence, wanted something so ugly and technical that no one would ever fall in love with it. And in the end, the word that went into the ledger, into the permanent classification schema of the conquered registry of worlds, beside habitable and hazardous and lifeless, was none of theirs. It was the word a junior clerk used in a working draft, the plainest word available, because she had watched the recording like everyone else and could not think of a better one. Homeworld. Not in the old sense, not a species planet of origin. A new sense defined in the statute with all the care the statute writers could muster and none of the warmth the thing deserved. A world otherwise hostile to organized life, rendered habitable to its native forms by the sustained presence of a keeper who provides and defends a place of rest. Interdicted on discovery, protected absolutely, salvage exempt in perpetuity. The lawyers hated it. The ethologists thought it too plain. The directorate mourned it like a death, which for their market it was. And out along the frontier, on 400 worlds that had been ruled dead by people looking for the wrong thing, human homesteaders who had filed cheap writs on sealed rocks to be left alone, read the new statute, and looked out their salvaged windows at whatever had been drifting in out of the cold to sit near their fires, and began, quietly, to understand what they had built. The next ship down onto Sarat did not come to take the world. It came to buy the trick, and Jonah liked it even less. Telluin came with it because they had asked her to, and because she had wanted an excuse to stand on the porch again, and because she no longer needed one but took it anyway. The inquiry was closed, her seal restored, her rulings good again, and she had spent the season since discovering that a restored assessor with a famous world in her file is invited to a great many things she would rather not attend. This was one of them. She rode down in the escort seat of a coalition delegation cutter and watched, through the glass, the ring come up green. That was the change that stopped her breath, more than any hall or ruling had. A season ago the world outside Jonah's markers had been flat gray ash to the horizon. Now, in a rough tide spreading out from the warm circle, there was color low tough green things pushing up through the ash where the near ground had been kept clean, a fringe of it a full half span out and growing, and small ordinary lives moving in it. The brown birds and things smaller than birds, life spilling past the stakes now, no longer clustered tight around the fire but spreading, the way life is supposed to, because the fire had held long enough to make a second safe place, and a third. The home had started to teach the world how to stop. It's growing, she said to no one. That's the finding the study buried on page 400, said the delegation's lead. A brisk coalition officer of a species Telluan didn't know, all crest and epaulets. Habitability index up 11 points in 1 year, from a campfire. He leaned toward the glass, hungry. You understand why we're here, Assessor. Do you have any notion what that's worth? Not the salvage the Directorate can keep its rocks. The method. 400 sealed worlds. Whole sectors written off as death worlds. And a human just demonstrated you can turn one habitable with a hut and a year of patience, if we can systematize it. You can't, Telluan said. Everything systematizes. You'll see, Telluan said, and did not explain, because she had learned that the explaining did no good, and because she wanted, a little, to watch him find out. Jonah met them on the porch with the pup at his boot. The pup was not a pup anymore. It had come up over the season into a low, broad, dark thing with the same terrible digging claws as the girls, and it had made itself, of all the places on the warm ground it could have chosen, a den directly under the porch step where Jonah's boot came down every morning, so that the first thing the young man did each day was stand on the roof of the newest and most useless life on the world. And the young thing had decided, in the way of young things, that this was the safest possible arrangement. And was not wrong. Bishop lay in the door. The girls came halfway up. Rafters shifted in the eaves. Pin was on her sill, folded in the sun, and Telluan watched the delegation's eyes find the huge shapes and slide right past the small drab one, exactly as everyone always did, and she did not warn them because Jonah would. You're the coalition, Jonah said. He had a cloth in one hand. He'd been oiling something. He did not put it down. Assessor, good to see you upright. You've got color back. Homesteader Reeve, the lead officer said, and produced a smile that had been briefed onto him, warm and wrong. We've come a long way to talk to you. On behalf of the Coalition Frontier Command, I'll come to the point because I'm told you appreciate directness. He spread his crest. We want to learn what you did here. Not to take it, the world's protected, we all respect that, congratulations. We want the method. There are 400 death worlds inside Coalition space that this could open. Whole populations that could be settled. We're prepared to be extraordinarily generous. A stipend, a title, a research station, a staff, whatever a man could want. All we ask is that you teach us how you pacified an apex biosphere so we can do it 400 times. Jonah oiled the thing in his hands. I didn't pacify anything, he said. With respect. I keep telling people that and they keep not writing it down. He set the cloth aside. You want to know the method, all right. Here's the method, all of it, no charge, and then you can fly home and tell the Frontier Command you got it. He looked at the officer. You build a dry roof and a fire that draws, and you make a warm, quiet place and you don't leave. Not for a season, not for a bad winter, not when the first thing comes up out of the dark to see what you are. You stay and you stay calm, and you let them come to the warmth on their own, one at a time in their own time, and you never once make it about you. And you keep it that way for years, for nothing, with no one watching, because you'd rather have a warm, quiet place than not, whether or not a single animal ever comes. That's the method. That's the whole of it. The officer waited for more. There was no more. That's not a method, he said. That's just living somewhere. Yeah, Jonah said. That's the part nobody can systematize. You want to do it 400 times, you need 400 people who'd build the fire even if no one ever came because they wanted the fire. The second you send someone who's doing it for the 400 worlds, for the settlement index, for the command, the animals know. I don't know how they know. Pin knows before I do. But they know when a place is a home and when it's a lure, and this world spent 1,000,000 years learning the difference between the two the hard way, and it will not put its head down for a lure. He picked the cloth back up. You can't buy what I did, officer, because the whole thing that makes it work is that it wasn't for sale. Send people who want to leave the galaxy and be left alone. Give them a cheap writ and a hauler and don't check on them. Some of them will build homes, and the homes will do this, and it'll cost you nothing, and you won't be able to take credit for any of it. That's the only way it runs." He tipped his head. "That's your systematization. It's called leaving people alone. Your frontier command's going to hate it." The officer left unsatisfied, which Telluin had expected, and having stayed, which she had not. The prefect had come down with the delegation as escort, a courtesy posting, she'd assumed, or a leash the directorate had put on a coalition it didn't trust. But when the cutter lifted, the great gray Korth did not board it. He stood at the markers, at the stake line he had heeded once and would heed for the rest of his service, and he watched the world grow green past the sticks, and Telluin came and stood beside him, the mountain and the reed, and for a while neither of them said anything. They retired the writ, having said finally, "Formally, last span, 40 having my own name on it voided in full. The package broke the way council said it would, 400 writs under review. The directorate I served for 100 years is being taken apart in daylight because I filed 4 lines instead of a clearance." He was quiet. "They offered me a posting far from any of it, a quiet sector, a way to fade. I declined." "To do what?" "To assess, having said, homeworlds. The new category needs prefects who will heed a line of sticks, and there are apparently going to be a great many of them, and the directorate has exactly 1 officer with experience heeding one." The great head turned, slow, toward the hut, toward the young man oiling a tool on the porch with the world's apex predator in his door and the world's deadliest thing folded in the sun on his sill. "I cleared 40 worlds, Assessor. I made 40 worlds lonely and called it lawful and never once lost a night's sleep because they were dead, or I told myself they were, which on a null listing is the same paperwork." He was quiet a long moment. He asked me if I understood how close I came to making this one lonely again. I have thought about that every day since. 40 worlds. I never asked on any of them whether the thing I was clearing was a hazard or a home. The ledger didn't have the column, so I didn't have the question. The head inclined, that slow mountain's bow. "I have the question now. I intend to spend what's left of my service asking it." Telluin looked at the green tide spreading past the stakes, at the brown birds in it, at the whole impossible warm world unfolding outward. From a fire a lazy young man had built because he was cold. "Humanity did not send us a fleet," she said, half to herself. "That's what they're all missing up in the halls. They keep waiting for the human method, the human weapon, the thing that pacified a deathworld, and they think if they can just buy it or copy it or systematize it, they'll have what the humans have." She shook her head. "Humanity didn't send a fleet or a weapon or a method. Humanity sent 1 tired young man who wanted to be left alone, and a fire, and the plain refusal to leave, and it turned out that was the one thing in the surveyed galaxy that a deathworld had never seen and could not defeat. Not a bigger predator, a porch." She almost smiled, which for an Asun was a considerable thing. "The coalition's going to spend a fortune trying to weaponize a porch. I hope I'm assigned to watch." Winter on Sarat came down like a lid, and it was in the worst of it, with the black water iced at the edges and the green tide dead back to root under the ash, that the world sent Jonah, the one visitor his porch was not built to hold. He knew it was coming before he saw it, because Bishop knew. The revenant had not left the doorway in 3 days, would not eat, would not sleep the deep sleep, lay across the threshold with his great head up and his slotted eyes open on the dark to the north, and the girls had gone down and stayed down, all of them, even the young one under the step, and Rafter had folded himself so far back into the eaves he was only a gleam, and Pin had come off her sill and vanished, which she did for nothing, which she did only when the whole world was about to change its mind. The ring had pulled in tight and gone quiet and afraid, and a ring that had faced a scaver crew and a prefect's complement without fear was afraid now, and Jonah banked the fire high and sat up with it and waited to find out what could do that. It came out of the north on the 4th night, and it was the size of the hut. Jonah watched it on the flu camera, and then he went out onto the porch to watch it with his own eyes. because some things you do not meet through a lens. It was another revenant bigger than Bishop, old, scarred, one eye gone milky, a thing that had held the top of this murderous world for longer than Bishop had been alive, and had been driven off its last range by the cold and the years, and was walking now toward the only heat left on the plain, because it was dying, and even a king dies cold if he cannot find a fire. It stopped at the edge of the light, beyond the stakes, a slate mountain steaming in the frozen dark, and it looked at the warm circle it had smelled from 100 spans away, and it looked at Bishop rising slow and enormous in the doorway to meet it. And Jonah understood that he was about to watch the two largest things on the world decide the oldest question there was, which was whose warmth this would be. Bishop came down off the porch and stood in the yard between the fire and the stranger, and did not charge and did not snarl, and stood, the way he had stood between Jonah and the thing he shouldn't eat that first winter, the way he had stood in the door between the pup and the dark. Just stood, just filled the space. This is kept. This is mine to keep. The old king took a step onto the warm ground. Jonah did not reach for the rifle. He had not touched it in 3 years, and he did not touch it now. He came down off the porch instead, past Bishop, out ahead of the world's apex predator, toward the dying stranger that could have folded him into the ash without noticing, because he had understood something in the long cold nights of waiting that he did not have good words for, and did not try to find them, only acted on it. That the home was not a thing you defended by driving the cold away. It was a thing you defended by having enough warmth that the cold could come in and stop being cold. Easy, Jonah said to the old king the way he'd say it to any of them. Easy. There's room. He would tell Telluen about it later, and she would not believe the first telling, and would come to believe it only when she stood on the spring ground and saw the two revenants asleep in the same yard. There was no fight. That was the thing the galaxy never quite accepted. The ones who watched the later recordings, the ones who wanted the old king, and the young one to settle it the way the surveys said this world settled everything. There was Jonah walking out ahead of Bishop into the frozen dark with his hands open and empty, saying easy, there's room. And there was the old king stopping, one milky eye and one gold one fixed on the small warm thing that had come out to meet it unafraid. And there was a long, long moment where the whole iced world held its breath, and the fire cracked in its stone box, and nothing at all happened. And then the old king lay down. It lay down at the edge of the light, where the warmth just reached, an arm's length beyond the stakes, the way a proud thing accepts a mercy it will not come all the way in to take, and it put its scarred head down on the warm ash, and it closed its ruined eye, and it stopped. For the first time in a long killing life, it stopped watching the dark, because there was a fire and a keeper, and a younger king who had come down off the porch not to drive it away but to make room. Bishop stood over it a while, the way he'd stood over the pup, deciding. Then he lay down too, 3 spans off between the old king and the fire, keeping still, and the girls came up one by one out of the ground to see, and rafter unfolded, and pin came back to her sill, and the ring settled around one more thing that had been allowed at the very end of it to stop. The old king lived till spring. Jonah dug it, the roots Bishop had shown him, and set them at the edge of the light where the proud old thing would take them, and it took them, and grew a little less gaunt, and in the first warm nights it moved in past the stakes at last and slept in the yard proper, and it died there in its sleep on a mild morning with the green coming up around it, and the fire warm at its back, which is not a thing that had ever once happened on Sarat in the whole million years before a lazy man built a porch. A king of that world dying old, and warm and unafraid, with something like a family asleep around it. Jonah buried it past the green line, in the ash, the old way, because that was the only funeral he knew. He did not say much over it. He was not a man of many words even to the living. But he stood there a while in the spring sun with Bishop beside him, and the girls, and the young one that wasn't a pup anymore, and the brown birds in the green, and he said the truest short thing he knew, which was, there was room. And then he went back and put the kettle on because it was morning and the fire wanted knocking down, and the living still had to be kept. The recording of the old king reached the halls before Jonah knew there was a recording, because by then the registry had put a permanent monitor in orbit over Sarat. Not to watch him, they assured him, but to document the first homeworld for the study, which amounted to the same thing, and which Jonah tolerated because it stayed in orbit and did not knock the kettle for him. Telluen watched it in the pale daylight of the same hall where the quorum had flinched, in a private viewing the seats had requested, because the seats were still trying, a full year on, to understand the thing they had been forced to protect. She watched a young man walk out unarmed into a frozen dark ahead of an apex predator to make room at a fire for a dying king, and she watched the fight that everyone expected simply not happen, and she watched the oldest and most murderous thing on a murderous world lie down in the reach of a stranger's warmth and stop, and when it was over the hall was silent, and one of the seats, an old one, a hard one of the 5 who had been ready to rule the world lifeless in a closed room a year before, spoke into the quiet. "We ruled at a slaughterhouse," the seat said. "Every survey, every pass, nothing that would gather, nothing that would hold. We were not wrong." The old voice was unsteady. "How were we not wrong, and this is also true? How is a world where the kings die killing and a world where the kings die warm the same world?" Telluen had spent 2 years on that question, and she had an answer now, and she gave it plainly, the way Jonah gave everything, because she had caught it from him and did not mind. "Because they were never the same world," she said. "You surveyed a world with no home in it, and you ruled it honestly, and everything you wrote was true of that world. And then a human built a home in it, and it became a different world, one the survey had no way to predict, because the survey measured everything about a planet except the one thing that turned out to matter most, which is whether anything on it is allowed to stop." She looked at the frozen frame on the wall, the young man and the dying king and the fire. "You did not misread Sarat honored seats. You read it before it was finished. It wasn't lifeless. It was only unfinished. It was waiting for someone to bring the last thing, and no survey in the history of the ledger ever thought to check whether a dead world was simply a world that no one had made a home in yet." She stood. "There are 400 more like it. I would like to go and see how many are still waiting." The study ran its 2 years and found exactly what everyone had known it would find, and the finding, entered into the ledger under the new column, was 4 words long where the original ruling had been 1. Not lifeless but inhabited homeworld interdicted permanent. And the first thing the permanent interdict did, to Jonah's quiet astonishment, was give him the one thing he had crossed the galaxy for in the first place, which was to be left alone. Because interdicted permanent meant closed. No salvage, which he had never worried about again after having. But also no landing, no tourism, no research parties, no pilgrims, and there were pilgrims by then, or there wanted to be. The recordings had made Sarat a place people spoke of the way they spoke of the few sacred things left, and had the interdict not slammed down over it, there would have been 100 cutters a season trying to set down at the edge of his markers, to see the fire with their own eyes, to be near the stopping, to touch the hem of the thing. The same pull that had brought the animals in out of the cold pulled the people too, and the people had ships. The interdict kept them off. It was absolute, and it was enforced from orbit, and the only exceptions written into it were an orbital monitor that stayed in orbit, and a single named assessor of the conquered registry granted standing to descend, at her own discretion, for the continued documentation of the site. "You did that," Jonah said to Telluen, the first time she came down after the interdict closed. "The exception. My name's not on the statute, but that clause is you." "The site requires documentation," Telluen said, which was a yes. 10 billion people want to stand on this porch, Jonah said, and the law says exactly one of them gets to, and it's the assessor who ruled it dead the first time. He almost smiled, which was, for him, a considerable thing. "I came out here to be left alone, and it took the whole galaxy falling in love with me to finally get it. There's a joke in that. I'm too tired to find the end of it." He put the kettle on. "Sit down. You want the not tea or the other not tea? There's two kinds now." Bishop showed me the second one. The years turned, and Telluin marked them the way she marked everything, and the record she kept of Sarat became the longest continuous document of a single place in the Registry's history, and the least like a survey. She watched the green tide reach the black water and cross it. She watched the brown birds become three kinds of bird, and then more, arriving from wherever birds wait out 1,000,000 years of a world with no rest. She watched the ring loosen and spread as the safe ground spread, until the tight, desperate circle of that first season had become something wider and calmer, a warmth that reached to the horizon in the good seasons, with the hut and the fire still at the heart of it, because a heart is where a thing begins, not the whole of what it becomes. She watched Bishop grow old. That was the hardest of the markings, and she did it faithfully, because Jonah asked her to and because someone should. The great slate king who had lain across the door the first day, who had risen to meet a prefect's compliment and lain back down, who had made room for a dying rival at the edge of the light. He grayed at the muzzle the way old dogs gray, and slowed, and slept the deep sleep more and woke to it less, and the young one that had come in a dying pup in Jonah's coat grew up broad and dark and terrible beside him and took, without anyone deciding it, the evening rounds of the yard that Bishop had walked when Bishop was king. The world's apex passed its keeping to the next, quietly, over seasons, the way it should always have gone and never once had, on a world where before the fire no king had ever lived long enough to grow old, let alone to teach a young one how to hold what he could no longer hold himself. "He's tired," Jonah said one autumn of Bishop, watching the old king sleep in the yard with the young one keeping watch beside him. "He's earned it. Longest-lived thing this world's ever made, I'd bet, because he got to stop." He was quiet a while. "That's the whole of what I did, Assessor, if you ever have to put it in one line. I didn't tame the deathworld. I just let its monsters get old." He knocked the ash off the flue. "Turns out a monster that gets to grow old isn't a monster anymore. It's just an elder. Nobody out here had ever seen one before me. They didn't know their own world had elders in it. It never lived long enough to find out." Telluin wrote that down, word for word, and it went into the permanent record of the first homeworld, and scholars 3 sectors away argued about it for a decade, and none of them ever improved on it because it was already true and already plain, which is the one combination the halls can never quite forgive. Having came once more before the end of it, an old prefect now himself, gray past gray, retired from the assessing he had taken up and slowed like the king he had once come to clear. He did not land. The interdict did not permit it, and he had spent the back half of his life learning to heed lines, and would not break this one even for himself. He held an orbit, and asked the monitor to turn its lens down onto the yard, and looked, one last time, at the world he had almost made lonely and had instead helped make law, and Telluin sat with him on the channel while he looked. 40 worlds, having said at length. I have thought at the end that I would like to know what became of them, the 40 I cleared, whether any of them had a home in it I called a hazard, whether any of them is still out there, gone quiet, that might have been a Sarat if I had asked the question I didn't have. The old voice was slow and even. I will not get to know. There is not time at the end to go back over 40 worlds, but I wanted to look at this one once more, and to say, on a channel that records, that I was wrong on all 40 and right on the 41st, and that the 41st is the only one that ever mattered, because it is the one that taught me the question. A pause. Tell the homesteader I heeded his line to the last. Tell him a mountain can learn to bow, if a small thing is patient enough to stand its ground on a line of sticks and mean it. "I'll tell him," Telluin said. "And tell him," having said, "that I have left instruction. When I go, I am not to be interred on my own world nor my people's. I am to be brought here, and set past the green line in the ash the old way at the edge of the light where the warmth just reaches, the way the humans set the old king, who would not come all the way in to take a mercy he had not kept. The great gray shape was still on the lens. I cleared 40 worlds and made them lonely. I should like at the end to be a thing that got to stop, if the home will have me. Telluin carried that down to the porch, and Jonah heard it out, and turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, and looked out at the green and the old king asleep and the young one on watch, and was quiet a long time. "There's room," he said at last. "Tell him there's always been room. That was the whole point of the place." He set the cup down. "Past the green line at the edge of the light. I'll dig it myself when it's time, same as the king." He looked at the sky where the old prefect held in orbit, unable to land, heeding the line to the last. He came the farthest of any of them to learn the simplest thing. That's not a small life, Assessor, whatever he thinks at the end of it. A man who cleared 40 worlds and then spent the rest of himself learning to make room. That's a good ending. That's better than most of us get. He knocked the ash off the flue twice out of habit. "There's room. There's always room. Now put the kettle on and let the old mountain watch us have our tea before he goes. I expect it's a thing worth seeing from up there. The whole point of it all in one frame. A fire and a table, and everything that used to be a monster, asleep in the light." There was one field in the ledger entry that had stayed empty for 4 years, and Telluin came down on a bright spring morning at last to fill it. She had put it off. It was a small thing and a large thing both, the way the truest things on Sarat always were. When a world moved from null listing to homeworld in the Registry's permanent schema, it stopped being a catalog code and became a place. And a place, by statute, took a name. Not a survey designation, not a string of digits, but a name entered by the keeper of record, which on the first homeworld in the history of the ledger meant a young man who had never in 4 years shown the slightest interest in naming anything he did not have to feed. "They need a name," she told him. She had the entry open on the reader slate, the long document of everything that had happened here, and the one field at the top of it still gray and empty. "For the ledger. It can't stay 7 Sarat, that was the null listing, the survey code. The homeworld needs a name, and the statute says it's yours to give. It's the last thing the entry is missing. It's been the last thing for 4 years. I kept not asking." Jonah was on the porch step, where he was always on the porch step, oiling something, with the old king asleep in the sun 3 spans off, and the young king, broad and dark and terrible now, the pup grown all the way up, lying in the door where Bishop used to lie, keeping it, because Bishop had passed the keeping on and gone gray and earned his rest. Pin was on the sill. The girls were down. A brown bird sang somewhere in the green that went to the horizon now, and the fire drew straight and gray into a spring sky, the flat blue of a stripped shell, exactly the color the archive had promised. Over a world the archive had ruled dead. "A name," Jonah said. "A name." He set the oiling cloth aside. He looked out at the green, at the 2 kings, at the whole warm world that had grown outward from the fire he'd built because he was cold, and Telluin watched him consider it with the same flat care he brought to straightening a steak, and she found she was holding her breath, which was absurd, which she did anyway. "I never gave it one," he said. "All this time, never needed to, it was just here. It was just home. You don't name your home, you just go in it." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table. "The clerk who stamped my writ named it, called it a null listing, called it a graveyard. That was its name far as anybody official was concerned, right up until you lot changed your minds. And I let that stand because a graveyard's a good name for a place you want to be left alone in." He almost smiled. "Doesn't fit anymore, though, does it? Nothing dies here that doesn't get to grow old first. That's the opposite of a graveyard. That's about as far from a graveyard as a place can get." "So what do I write?" Telluin said. Jonah looked at the kettle on the stone box by the fire. "Kettle," he said. Telluin waited for more. There was, in the way of him, no more. "Kettle," she repeated. "You knock it twice when the fire's banked and you're in for the night, and everything that's out in the dark hears it and knows the warm place is holding and settles." He picked the spoon up off the table and turned it over, the small habitual motion, 4 years old now and older. the habit that had turned into a signal that the scholars had given a solemn name he'd found so funny. First winter, I knocked the pot to settle the ash. Now the whole world knocks off for the night when I do it. It's the truest thing that happens here. It's the thing the place is built around when you get all the fancy words off it. A sound that means you're allowed to stop watching the dark now. He set the spoon down. That's the whole world in one word if you have to have one. Call it kettle. Nobody'll understand it but the ones who have heard it, and the ones who have heard it don't need it written down. That's how you know it's the right name. It's no use to anyone who wasn't here. He looked at her. Write kettle. And then, if you don't mind, stop writing for a while and drink your not tea, because you came a long way and the sun's good and the old boy likes company even asleep, and there's not going to be a season this good forever, and a thing this good's a waste if nobody just sits in it. Talyuan looked at the gray field at the top of the ledger entry, the last empty thing in the longest document in the registry's history. She wrote kettle. Then she set the slate down on the porch boards, face down, so the light of it wouldn't compete with the sun, and she picked up the tin cup of bitter root brew that a monster had taught a man to find, and she drank her not tea in the warmth of the first home a deathworld had ever been allowed to have. And for a while, a long good while, the assessor of the conquered Registry of Worlds did not mark anything at all. She stayed until the light failed, which she did every time now, because the failing of the light was the best of it. She watched Jonah do his rounds at dusk, top the trough, walk the line of stakes with his hands in his coat pockets, push the leaning one straight. He stopped at the third stake from the gate, over the turned earth where the young king had denned as a pup and crouched, and said something quiet down into the dark, though nothing denned there now, and the ground did not move in answer, and he said it anyway, 4 years on, out of a habit that had turned into a kind of grace. Rafter dropped out of the eaves and swept the ring once at the height of a running person, and folded himself back into a different beam, and nothing on the whole wide green world moved for a full minute after, the way nothing had moved that first evening when there had been only ash. The girls came up to drink. The young king walked the far edge of the light. The old king slept, gray and enormous and unafraid, in the last warm patch of the day, longest-lived thing the world had ever made, and would be a while yet, because he got to stop. And Jonah came back up onto the porch and picked the spoon up off the table and knocked the side of the kettle. Twice. Tang, tang, small and flat and carrying. All across the darkening world, ears and eyes turned toward the sound and then away, reassured. The warm place was holding. They were allowed to stop watching the dark. Talyuan stood to go. She always hated this part, and did it anyway, because the interdict let exactly one creature stand on this porch, and it would not do to wear the privilege out. They still argue about you in the halls, she said, 4 years on. They still can't systematize it. The coalition spent a fortune, you know. Settled 40 null listings with picked homesteaders on generous stipends, all told to build a fire and wait. 39 of them failed. The animals wouldn't come or came and didn't stay. The scholars can't work out why yours took and theirs didn't. She looked at him. I never told them why. I have a guess. I've had it 4 years. I've never put it in the record. What's your guess? Jonah said. That the 39 were building the fire so the world would come, Talyuan said. For the stipend, the index, the command. And you built the fire because you were cold and would have built it and kept it and knocked the kettle every night of your life, whether or not one single living thing ever came in out of the dark to have it. She pulled her coat straight. You didn't make a home for the monsters, Jonah. You made a home. The monsters just recognized one because you weren't doing it at them. That's the whole trick, and it's why it's not a trick, and it's why they'll never buy it, and it's why I've never written it down. The moment it's a method, it stops working. The only ones it works for are the ones who do it for nothing. She stepped down off the porch, past the young king, who watched her go with the unworried gaze of a thing that had long since decided she was fine. You came out here to be left alone. You ended up building the one thing the whole galaxy can't stop wanting, and the only reason it works is that you never wanted the galaxy to want it. There's a joke in that, too. I've had 4 years. I still can't find the end of it either. She lifted the cutter into a spring night gone soft and warm over a world that 11 years of careful survey had ruled incapable of holding life, and she looked down, the way she had looked down the first morning, and where there had been one thread of gray smoke rising from a single fire in a dead gray waste, there was now a wide, low glow of warmth spread to the edges of the dark, and life in all of it, and at the heart of it a fire and a table, and a young man drinking the last of his not tea on a porch, with a gray old king asleep at his feet. The life skin drew its long line across the panel. It was not flat anymore. It had not been flat in 4 years, and it would never be flat again, and no survey would ever rule this world lifeless a second time, because the word was finished here, finished the day. A lazy young man decided he would rather be warm than be right, and built a place where a thing could stop. Telluen keyed the record one last time before she cleared atmosphere, the way she had keyed it the first morning, and her voice came out level, and she was proud of that, the way you are proud of the small, steady things at the end of a long day. Assessment log Vox of the conquered Registry of Worlds, she said. Standing survey of the homeworld kettle. Be advised the world is well. Be advised the keeper is well. Be advised the kings are old, which is the finding because on this world before, no king ever was. She watched the warm glow slide away beneath her into the curve of the planet. Be advised there is nothing here to correct, and nothing here to clear, and nothing here that needs us at all, which after 400 worlds is the strangest entry I have ever made, and the only one I have ever been glad to leave standing. A pause. She thought of a spoon on a table and 2 flat notes and a whole dark world settling. Log ends. Be advised the fire is banked, and the kettle is knocked, and everything that used to be a monster is asleep in the light, and the survey that ruled this place a graveyard may enter in the column beside its ruling the plain correction of the fact. She almost smiled. It was only ever a graveyard because no one had built the porch. Vox out. Below her, on the porch, the young man knocked the ash off the flue with the flat of his hand twice out of habit and went in to bank the fire, and the door he closed behind him had once been held open by a monster and would be again by morning, and the world he closed it against was not the dark anymore. It was just the night. There is a difference, and the difference is a home, and a young man too tired and too plain to know he had done anything remarkable had made the first one a deathworld ever had, out of a hauler and a fire and the refusal to leave, and every creature that had ever wanted to stop was asleep, at last, in the warmth of it. He put the kettle on. It was morning somewhere. There was always more day. And the living, monster and man and the small, drab, deadly thing folded in the dark on the sill still had to be kept.